Settle in now. Let the weight of the day begin to leave your shoulders. Let your breathing slow and allow yourself to drift towards something ancient and quietly beautiful. Because tonight we are going to travel back together. Back across an almost unimaginable distance of time. To a world that smelled of salt and thyme and wood smoke. Where the sea was never far from any door. And where the stories people told one another in the evenings were stories that the world has never quite been able to let go of. And if you find comfort in these slow nighttime journeys, if you discover that a quiet voice and an old story are just the right companions for the edge of sleep, then perhaps you might consider subscribing so that these tales are always there waiting for you, night after night, whenever you need them. And if you feel moved to leave a small comment, just a word or two about where in the world you are listening from tonight, then know that you would be joining a gentle, scattered community of sleepless souls, from one side of the globe to the other, all finding their way toward rest through the same ancient stories. It is a quietly lovely thing to imagine all of you, lights low, in so many different rooms. But now, close your eyes if you like, and come with me to the wine-dark sea. The Mediterranean in the age we are speaking of was not yet quite the sea we recognize from maps and histories, though it was the same water, the same deep and restless blue, the same long swells moving in from the open west to break in white foam against limestone headlands and rocky coves. This was the Bronze Age, a time scholars place at roughly 3,000 years before our own, or perhaps a little more, in those centuries between, say, 1,500 and 1,100 years before the Common Era began. It was an age that felt, even to the people living in it, like something poised at the edge of greatness, something luminous and precarious all at once, the way a lamp flame is most beautiful just before the oil runs low. The world of what we now call Bronze Age Greece was not a unified country, not yet, perhaps not ever in quite the way we mean the word. It was a scattering, a long, irregular archipelago of island kingdoms and coastal settlements, each one cupped in its own small geography, separated from its neighbors by mountain ridges or stretches of open sea, and yet connected to all of them by the same blue water that kept them apart. Sailors were the threads that stitched this world together, and the sea was the loom on which all its commerce and conflict and communication was woven. The islands themselves were things of extraordinary, unhurried beauty. Imagine them in the long amber light of a late afternoon, their hillsides terraced with olive trees, whose leaves caught the breeze and turned silver, then green, then silver again. The smell of wild oregano drifted down from the higher slopes in summer, and in the spring, the hillsides were dense with flowers, asphodels and anemones in pale purples and deep reds, growing right down to the edge of the cliffs. Lower down, where the land flattened toward the shore, there were orchards, figs and pomegranates and pears, and kitchen gardens that the women of each household tended with a quiet daily devotion. The soil was thin and stony in most places, the kind of soil that required patience, that rewarded effort slowly and reluctantly, but rewarded it nonetheless. The palaces of this age, and we know about them now largely because archaeologists spent the 19th and 20th centuries gently excavating their ruins from the Greek earth, were not the white marble temples of a later time. They were something older, something earthier, and more labyrinthine, built of thick stone blocks and heavy timbers. Their walls plastered smooth and then painted, often, in warm ochres and deep russets, and the particular blue-green of the sea on a calm morning. These were places called, by the archaeologists who found them, Mycenaean palaces, after the greatest of their number, the citadel of Mycenae itself, which sat on a rocky hill in the northeastern Peloponnese and looked out over a wide, dry plain toward the distant sea. At the center of each palace was a room called the Megaron, a great hall really, with a circular hearth at its heart and a hole in the roof above it to let the smoke drift up into the open sky. The fires in those hearths were kept burning through the day and into the night, and the smell of wood smoke was so constant, so woven into the fabric of palace life, that it was probably not something the people living there even noticed anymore, not until they were away from it, and then perhaps it came to them as the smell of home, something that pulled at something deep and wordless in the chest. Torches burned in brackets along the walls, and their light moved always, breathing and shifting, so that the painted figures on the plaster seemed to stir, and the shadows of the tall-backed chairs and the heavy wooden tables moved like slow, companionable presences across the floor. Life in these palaces was organized with a complexity that archaeologists have reconstructed, very carefully and with considerable uncertainty in the details, from thousands of small clay tablets inscribed in a script called Linear B, a script that turned out, when it was finally decoded in the 1950s, to be an early form of Greek. The tablets are almost entirely administrative, lists of goods received and distributed, tallies of livestock and grain and bronze, the names of craftsmen and the items they were owed. They are not romantic documents, they are the receipts and inventories of a functioning bureaucracy, and yet in their very ordinariness, they give us something precious. They tell us that this was a real and working world, with real and working people, counting their jars of olive oil and their flocks of sheep, writing things down so they would not be forgotten. Outside the palace walls, the rhythms of life were older still, older than writing, older than bronze. Fishermen went out in the early dark before dawn, when the sea was still and the stars were still overhead, and came back in the middle morning with their catches spread on the beach to be sold or traded or salted and stored. Farmers moved with the slow turning of the year, plowing in autumn when the first rains softened the earth, sowing in winter, watching through spring as the green came up, cutting and threshing in the long, dry heat of July. Women spun wool by hand and wove it on upright looms, and the sound of the loom, the rhythmic thump and click of the shuttle, was one of the background sounds of every household, as constant and as unremarkable as the sound of the sea. The sea, though, the sea was never truly unremarkable. It was too present, too various, too changeable for that. In the morning it could be almost perfectly still, its surface smooth and glassy, reflecting the pale gold of the sky, and a small boat could cross a stretch of open water between two islands as easily as walking a familiar path. By the afternoon the wind could have come up from the north or the west, and the same stretch of water would be steep, with short, close-set waves, white-capped and unforgiving, and the boat that had crossed it gently in the morning would have to fight its way home, spray flying, the crew bailing and praying in equal measure. The Greeks of this age were not reckless about the sea. They respected it with the careful, intimate respect of people who had been taught by it over generations exactly what it was capable of. And it was in this world, this salt-scented, fire-lit, many-islanded world, that the stories we think of as the oldest in Western literature were shaped. Not written yet, not for centuries, but told aloud and passed from mouth to ear, from one generation to the next, changing slightly each time in the way that living things change, growing richer, growing more layered, accumulating detail the way a shoreline accumulates driftwood, each piece of it coming from somewhere specific, each piece of it telling a small story of its own. Tonight, we have only just arrived at the edge of this world, only just let our eyes adjust to its particular quality of light. There is much more to find here, a particular island quieter than most, shaped by hills and harbor, fragrant with goats and salt wind and the smoke of a hearth that has been burning, it seems, since the beginning of the world. That island is waiting for us in the chapter ahead, resting in its own slow afternoon, unhurried and extraordinarily peaceful. But for now, let the sea settle around you. Let the wood smoke drift. Let the sound of the loom and the sound of the waves become, for a little while, the same sound, low and repetitive and restful. You are in good hands, and the night is long, and there is no hurry at all. There is an island at the edge of the western sea, where the mornings arrive slowly, feeling their way in across dark water before the sun has properly decided to rise, and for a long time, for years and years of mornings that no one thought to count because there was no reason to count them, that island knew only the ordinary sweetness of its own unhurried life. Ithaca. Even the name, if you let it rest on your tongue without hurrying past it, carries something of that quality, a smallness, a particularity, the feeling of a place that knows exactly what it is and has never wished to be larger. It sits among its sister islands in the Ionian Sea, like a stone that has found the perfect hollow to rest in, surrounded on all sides by water that changes its color through the day, from the deep black purple of early morning, that wine-dark shade the old poets loved to name, through gray and green and a particular shade of hammered silver at midday. and then at evening into something warmer, something amber and bronze and faintly rose, as though the sea itself were slowly remembering the sun that had just left it. The water was always there, always present, always shifting, always the first thing you heard when you woke, and the last thing that found your ears before sleep. A long, low breathing against the rocks below the terraces, patient and rhythmic and entirely without urgency, like the breathing of something very old that has long since made its peace with time. The island was not large. You could walk its length in a long afternoon, climbing the rocky spine that ran through its middle and descending the other side through terraces of olive and fig and wild thyme, the scrub rustling with invisible lizards, the air thick with the scent of warm stone and dry herbs, and always, underneath everything, the mineral salt of the surrounding sea. The paths were old paths, worn into the pale rock by generations of feet that had walked them for no grander purpose than the carrying of oil jars and the leading of goats, and the slow contemplative business of getting from one place to another, on an island where there was rarely any great hurry to arrive. The goats themselves were everywhere, picking their way along ledges that seemed barely wide enough to hold them, turning to regard a passing stranger with their strange, flat, ancient eyes, their bells making a soft, irregular music that drifted across the hillsides and mixed with the sound of the wind and the olive leaves. The olive trees were very old. Some of them, it seemed, had been old for so long that they had moved past age into something else entirely, their trunks twisted into shapes of great character and patience, their silver-gray leaves trembling constantly in the slightest breeze as though they were always in the middle of a whispered conversation. In the season when they ripened, the whole island smelled of them. A green and grassy fragrance with something darker underneath, something earthy and rich, and the households would send their people out to spread the cloths beneath the branches and begin the long, satisfying work of the harvest. The soft, steady sound of olives falling onto linen, filling the mornings for days at a time. The oil they pressed was pale gold, faintly luminous when you held it to the light, and jars of it stood in every storeroom, ranked in their cool, dark rows, their clay sides beaded with the chill of the stone floors beneath them. The palace, if you could call it that, and the people of Ithaca called it so with a quiet, unboastful pride, sat on the higher ground above the harbor, its walls of fitted stone still holding the warmth of the afternoon sun, long after the evening had cooled the air around them. It was not the great labyrinthine palace of Knossos, nothing like the sprawling, painted corridors that larger kingdoms could claim, but it had its own kind of dignity. Its great hall opened to the evening air through wide doorways, its hearth at the center, giving off a steady amber light that pressed warmly against the painted walls, and made the figures there, the octopus, the dolphin, the sea flowers, rendered in their flat and stylized grace, seem almost to move. The smell of the hall in the evening was of wood smoke and roasting meat, and the resinous wine that was always being poured, always present in its deep-bellied amphora, and beneath these the faint older smell of the stone itself, cool and faintly damp, like a cave that has been made comfortable. The harbor below was small and sheltered, curved like a cupped hand, the water inside it nearly always still, regardless of what the open sea was doing beyond the headland. The fishing boats went out before first light, their dark shapes moving across the water without sound, and came back in the mid-morning with their catches gleaming silver in the bilges, and the smell of fish and salt and wet rope was as ordinary a part of the day as the smell of bread from the kitchen courtyard, and no more remarkable. Children ran along the stone quay. Old men sat in the same places they had sat for decades, talking or not talking with equal contentment, watching the water and the light on the water with the focused patience of people who have understood that watching the sea is its own sufficient occupation. And Penelope was there, here in these years before. She was simply a young woman of remarkable intelligence and quiet beauty, moving through her own household with an unhurried capability, managing the stores and the servants and the weaving rooms with a calm attention that never raised its voice. The loom was already hers in these years, already the place where her hands knew best what to do, and the sound of the shuttle passing through the warp was one of the woven sounds of the palace, as natural as the wind and the water, as regular as breathing. The cloth she made was fine, its patterns precise and intricate, and it is said that she taught the women of her household to achieve a fineness that other islands admired, though she spoke of this, if she spoke of it at all, without any particular pride, as simply the proper way to do the work. Telemachus was not yet born in these earliest peaceful years, and then he was born, and the sounds of the palace changed in the particular way that a household changes when a child arrives. Something loosened, something brightened in a small and private way, a new set of small sounds added to the existing ones, a new shape moving through the rooms, finding everything for the first time. The nurses carried him through the courtyard in the afternoons, and the smell of the sea came in over the walls, and the olive leaves trembled their silver undersides in the breeze off the water. And it is easy, and perhaps forgivable, to imagine that the island held these years with a particular gentleness, the way you might hold something without quite knowing that you will one day be asked to give it back. Odysseus himself moved through all of this, through the terraces and the harbor, and the great hall in the evening firelight, with the easy familiarity of a man who has never needed to be anywhere else, to feel entirely himself. He knew every path on the island, knew the name of every bay and promontory, in the way that people know the faces of their family, without needing to think, without any space between seeing and recognizing. He went down to the boats in the mornings, and out to the farms on the higher ground, and sat in the evenings with his household and his wine. And the sea was always there, at the edge of everything, breathing its long breath against the stone below the terraces, present and patient, and entirely without menace in those years, simply the condition in which the island existed, the element in which Ithaca floated like something held gently in place by invisible hands. These were the years that would later be carried in memory, the way a person carries the smell of their childhood home, not always at the front of the mind, but always present somewhere deeper, surfacing in unexpected moments, with a completeness and an ache that newer and more vivid experiences could never quite produce. The island at peace, the oil jars cool in their rows, the shuttle moving through the loom, the goat bells on the hillside, and the water breathing below. Let all of that settle now as you rest, as the evening finds its quiet depth around you. In the morning of the world, there were men of great cleverness as well as great strength, and Ithaca had shaped one such man with particular care, had given him the rocky paths and the gray olives and the patient sea, and the grandfather who came in from the mainland with his famous cunning. And all of this had made someone remarkable and curious, and perhaps a little too ready when the time came to prove what he was made of somewhere beyond the horizon. But that is a story for another drift into sleep. And for now the harbor is still, and the olive trees are breathing, and the sea is dark and patient beyond the headland, and there is no need yet to go anywhere at all. The smell of wild thyme comes first, carried on a breeze from the hillside above the harbor, drifting down through the olive groves and settling, soft as a whisper, over the town below. It is morning on Ithaca, or perhaps it is the quiet hour just before morning, when the sky has not yet decided what color it wishes to become, and the sea lies still and silver in the darkness, breathing slowly, as if it too has only just woken and is not yet ready to speak. This is the hour that belongs to thought, to memory, to the slow turning over of old stories, and there is no story on this island older or more often told than the one that begins not with a ship or a war, but with a name, Odysseus. The word itself is worth holding for a moment, turning it gently the way you might turn a smooth stone found at the water's edge. The ancient poets knew something about the weight of names, and this one carries within it a shadow of meaning that scholars have puzzled over for many long centuries. It is said that the name may carry within it the old Greek sense of trouble, of being the cause of suffering, or perhaps of bearing it. And it is a remarkable thing to consider that even before this man had done anything at all, even before he had spoken his first words, or taken his first unsteady steps across the packed earth floor of his father's hall, his very name already seemed to know something about his life that he himself could not yet suspect. His father was Laertes, a king of Ithaca, a man remembered as steady and capable, and deeply fond of his orchards, a man who would one day be found in his garden, tending his trees with careful hands, while the whole world around him came apart and was slowly put back together. His mother was Anticlea, daughter of Autolycus, and it is in that maternal line that many who study these old stories say you can find the seed of what Odysseus would become. Autolycus is a figure who hovers at the edge of the Greek mythological world, charming and slightly unsettling, a man whose name is bound up with cunning, with the gift of disguise, with the easy rearranging of truth into shapes more useful to the moment. He was said to be a son of Hermes himself, the messenger god, the divine trickster, the god of travelers and thieves and clever speeches, and whether or not one takes that lineage literally, it tells you something important about the family into which Odysseus was born. It is said that when the child was still an infant, Autolycus came to Ithaca to visit his daughter and her new son, and that it was he who gave the boy his name. There is something quietly significant about that, about the gift of a name coming from the grandfather, who embodied cleverness and the turning of situations to advantage. As though Autolycus looked into the face of this small new person and recognized something of himself there, something that would need a name large enough to hold it. There is another story about Autolycus and Odysseus, one that takes place a little later, when the boy was old enough to travel, old enough to be sent to his grandfather's home on Mount Parnassus to collect a promised gift. The visit is remembered not only for the warmth of the reunion, for the long tables set with food, and the old man's pleasure at seeing his grandson grown, but for the hunt that followed, the boar hunt on the slopes of Parnassus that left Odysseus with a scar above the knee, a white crescent of old tissue that would follow him for the rest of his life, that would one day, many long years later, give him away in the most tender and dangerous of moments, a wound earned in the company of his grandfather, a mark left on him by the world of cunning and forests and the sharp surprise of things that come at you from the underbrush. He carried it always. Growing up on Ithaca, the young Odysseus would have moved through a world of salt air and limestone paths and the sound of goats on the hillside and the distant, constant conversation of the sea. He would have learned, as all island children learn, to read the water, to understand the particular shade of green that means shallows and the particular darkness that means depth, to feel in his body the difference between a wind that is simply wind and a wind that is weather coming. He would have grown strong and quick, and the stories suggest that he was never the largest or the most physically imposing of the Greek heroes, never the kind of man who stopped conversation simply by walking into a room in the way that Achilles or Ajax might. His power was quieter than that. It lived behind his eyes. The poets speak of his gift for language as something almost uncanny, something that went beyond ordinary persuasion. It is said that when Odysseus stood up to speak in the assembly of kings, something settled in the room, some quality of attention that even the proudest and most impatient men could not quite resist. His words came slowly at first, they say, like a man who is choosing carefully, who knows the weight of each phrase and will not spend them carelessly. And then they gathered, and what seemed at first like hesitation revealed itself as precision. And the assembled kings would find that by the time he had finished, they had already agreed with him, without quite knowing how it had happened. This was not a comfortable gift to be near, perhaps, but it was an extraordinary one. And then there was Penelope. The story of how Odysseus came to win her as his wife is one that the ancient sources tell in different ways and with different emphases, but the heart of it seems to involve a gathering of suitors at the court of her father Icarius in Sparta, or thereabouts, men who came from across the Greek world to compete for the hand of a woman known for her beauty and, perhaps more significantly, for the quality of her mind. It is said that Odysseus arrived among this company of suitors not as the most powerful king or the most celebrated warrior, but as himself, which is to say as a man of considerable intelligence and absolute conviction about what he wanted, and that what unfolded between them was something that went beyond the ordinary calculations of political marriage in the heroic age. The story goes that when the time came, and Penelope was asked to choose, she chose Odysseus, and that her father Icarius, who had hoped she might remain nearby, followed the departing couple down the road and begged his daughter to stay. Penelope, it is said nothing in reply, but simply drew her veil across her face, a gesture of quiet that somehow contained within it everything she had decided. A gesture that was neither coldness nor cruelty, but simply the clear and private statement of a woman who had made up her mind and did not require anyone else's permission to act upon it. Odysseus watched this happen, the old stories tell us, and understood something in that moment, understood that he had married someone as particular and as resolute as himself, someone who would keep her own counsel and hold her own ground, and that this would matter more than he could possibly know. They went home to Ithaca together, and for a time there was only home. There was the palace on the hill above the harbor. There was the sound of the sea reaching up through the olive groves. There was the warmth of a fire in the great hall on winter evenings. And after a time, there was a son, Telemachus, whose name means something like the fighter from afar, another name carrying within it the echo of a future not yet arrived. The island held them gently in those years, and the smell of thyme from the hillside and the silver gleam of the water in the harbor and the ordinary, unhurried rhythms of a small kingdom at peace with itself. Odysseus was the man of many turns, polytropos, many-minded, much wandered, and all of that was still ahead of him, folded into a future he could not see. But on those quiet evenings, with the firelight moving on the walls of his own hall, and the sound of the sea settling into the night outside, he was simply a man on his island, and the island was enough. The sea lay dark and patient at the edge of everything, neither calling nor threatening, simply present, as it always was and always would be, breathing slowly in the dark. Soon enough something would stir in that darkness. Soon enough a ship would come with news from the wider world, and the wide world would require something of him. But that is a story for another night, a shore to approach only when you are ready. For now, let the thyme-scented air of Ithaca settle around you, and let the sea breathe its slow dark breath at the edge of your dreaming. The harbor at Aulis fills slowly, the way a bay fills with morning light, not all at once, but in increments, each new arrival adding its color and weight to something already in motion, something that cannot now be stopped. Ships come from the east, and ships come from the west, from rocky headlands and from river mouths, from kingdoms so small they might be held in a single glance from a hilltop, and from kingdoms so broad that their names alone carried the weight of mountains. They come with their painted prows and their folded linen sails, with their oars shipped inward and dripping, with their rowers' hands already roughened from the crossing, and they settle into the shallow water of that sheltered Boeotian strait, like birds settling onto a winter lake, cautiously, crowding gently together, finding their places in a pattern that no single person has designed, but that arranges itself, as if by long agreement, into something very like an army. This was how the great fleet gathered, in the months before the war that would consume a decade of the world's slow turning. The harbor at Aulis was not a grand place in the way that Mycenae was grand, with its golden masks and its lion gate, and its stones fitted so precisely together that a blade of grass could not pass between them. Aulis was quieter, more practical, a narrow strait between the island of Euboea and the mainland of Boeotia, where the currents ran strong and the winds off the water carried the smell of brine and pine resin and the faint char of 1,000 cooking fires. The land around it rose in low hills furred with scrub oak and wild thyme, and in the evenings the light across the water turned the color of old bronze, soft and warm and somehow already ancient, as though the place had always known it would hold this moment, that it had been saving itself for exactly this accumulation of ships and men and purposes. They came in their hundreds. The story goes that more than 1,000 ships gathered there across those long weeks, though the counting of such things is always uncertain, and the numbers that have reached us may have grown in the telling, as numbers always do when enough years have passed. But whether 1,000 or somewhat fewer, the effect upon any watching shepherd standing on the hillside above the strait would have been the same, a kind of breathlessness, a sense that the world was doing something it had never quite done before, that history was bending itself into a new shape, and that the bending would leave a mark. Great Agamemnon was there, the king of Mycenae, the lord of lords, with his dark beard and his heavy golden scepter, and his air of a man who carries his authority the way a wall carries its stones, not lightly, but without apparent effort. Menelaus was there, quieter than the stories would later make him, a man with reddened hair and an expression of patient sorrow that sat on his face like weather. Achilles was there, young and restless and burning with a quality that was not quite pride and not quite anger, but something between them, something that had no easy name, moving through the camp as though the ground beneath him were slightly insufficient for what he was. Nestor was there, old even then, speaking in long, careful sentences that curved around their subjects the way rivers curve around stones, and the younger men listened to him with the particular attention that people give to those who have already survived what others are only imagining. And Odysseus was there. He had come at last. The story of how Odysseus was found on Ithaca how he was discovered by some accounts, pretending to have lost his reason, plowing his fields with a mule and an ox yoked together, scattering salt into the furrows instead of seed, is told in fragments across many sources, and it is said that the clever Palamedes saw through the ruse by placing the infant Telemachus in the path of the plow, and that Odysseus, unwilling to harm his son, turned the plow aside, and was thus revealed as sane and capable, and obligated, like all the others, to honor the old oath he had sworn. Whether this is exactly how it happened, or whether the story has softened or sharpened itself over the long passage of time, cannot now be said with certainty. But the feeling of it, a man choosing between his child and his word, between the life he has built and the life he is being called toward, that feeling has the texture of something true. He would have stood at the edge of the water at Ithaca before he left. It is the kind of moment that lodges in the imagination and refuses to be moved because it contains too much. The smell of salt and wild fig, the sound of the goats on the upper terraces, the distant whitewash of the palace walls in the early light. Penelope would have been there, composed in the way that women of those stories are often described as composed, which is to say, carrying a great deal beneath a surface that does not betray it. Telemachus would have been very small, perhaps too small to understand what departure meant, though perhaps old enough to feel it. And Odysseus, who understood everything about strategy and language, and the way that words could be arranged to mean several things at once, would have stood at the boundary of the world he had made and the world that was calling him, and he would have felt the particular weight of that kind of morning. He was even then a man who looked at the horizon and calculated it. The sea to him was not simply beautiful, it was readable, a surface full of information about wind direction and weather and distance, about what lay on the other side of what you could see. He had sailed these waters since boyhood. He knew the way the Ionian light lay differently in autumn than in spring, and the way the currents and the channels between islands had their own personalities, their own habits. He knew Ithaca's waters the way you know the face of someone you love, not just the general impression, but the particular details that only long familiarity reveals. And so his departure would have had a quality of double vision about it. He would have been watching the horizon in the practical way that sailors watch it, assessing, planning, already thinking about the crossing to the mainland and then the long pull toward Alice. And, at the same time, he would have been taking the island in through every sense available to him, storing it, as if some part of him already understood, without wanting to, that it would have to last. At Alice, in those long weeks before the fleet could sail, the great assembly waited. The winds were wrong, stubbornly, persistently wrong, holding the ships in harbor with a firmness that began to feel, to the men gathered there, less like weather and more like intention. Smoke from the cooking fires drifted across the water in the mornings. The men who had come from distant kingdoms sat together in groups that slowly became familiar to one another, learning to share fire and food and complaint, which is one of the oldest ways that strangers become something more like allies. Swords were sharpened, stories were told, old grievances were negotiated into something workable, and new friendships formed in the patient, unglamorous way that friendships always form when people are waiting together for something larger than themselves. Odysseus moved through the camp with his particular quality of attentiveness. He spoke to everyone, to kings and to oarsmen, to priests and to cooks, gathering the texture of this assembled world into himself, storing it in whatever part of him stored such things. He was already, even here, already away from Ithaca and the small warm life he had left behind, that life of olive groves and well-known paths and a wife who understood him. But he was not yet anywhere else. He was in between. He was, as he would so often be in the years to come, a man in motion between one world and another. The winds, it is said, eventually changed. The fleet found its moment. The oars dipped into the Euripus current, and the long line of painted ships began to move northward and eastward, away from the coast of Greece, toward a horizon that held a city neither Odysseus nor any of them had seen, though all of them had heard its name in the way you hear the name of a place you will one day visit, as something distant, slightly unreal, waiting. The smoke from Aulis thinned, and disappeared behind them. The sea spread out in all directions, vast and deeply colored in the late afternoon light. And on the water that evening, the cooking fires the crews made in their small clay hearths glowed like low stars scattered across a moving darkness, tiny, warm, and impossibly far from home. The plain stretches wide and pale before you, caught in that hour just before the sun fully commits to rising, when the sky holds a color that has no real name, something between ash and bronze and the faintest memory of violet. And the Trojan plain in those long years would have looked like this each morning, gray and enormous and very still, broken only by the dark shapes of ships pulled up along the shore like sleeping animals, and by the low smoke of 1,000 cook fires drifting sideways in the earliest breath of wind off the Hellespont. Imagine you are standing at the edge of one of those fires now. Not a fire of battle, not a fire of triumph, but an ordinary fire, the kind that has been lit in the same place so many times that the ground around it is permanently darkened, permanently warm to the touch even in the small hours of the night. A flat stone serves as a table. A bronze tripod holds a pot that has seen perhaps 3,000 mornings. Someone has wedged a spear into the earth at an angle, not because danger is expected, but because it is a useful thing to hang a cloak upon. And the cloak is still damp from the night air, and it will take until mid-morning to dry. This is what the siege of Troy looked like, for most of its 10 years. Not the shining thing that later centuries would make of it, not the continuous roar and clash that the word war tends to conjure, but this, the quiet, the waiting, the ordinary domesticity of men who have been away from home so long that they have learned to make something like home out of whatever was near to hand. The Greek camp ran along the shore of the Aegean in a long curve, its arrangement roughly following the order of the ships, each contingent camped behind its own vessels, each captain's hut a little more substantial than the men's quarters around it. After a year, some of these structures had taken on the character of something almost permanent, roofed with sailcloth or with timber cut from the hills behind the plain, walled against the wind with whatever could be stacked, spare oars, old shields, great coils of rope turned hard and brown with salt. After 5 years, there were men in that camp who had grown from boys into something approaching adulthood entirely within its boundaries, who could not have said with any real confidence what their home villages looked like in the summer. The smell of the camp in the morning would have been the smell of wood smoke and of bread, if there was grain enough, and of salt water and of animals, for the Greeks kept cattle and goats along the edges of the camp, animals they had gathered from raiding parties into the country round about Troy, and these animals lent the whole long encampment a low and constant sound, a shuffling and lowing that mixed with the voice of the sea and became simply part of the texture of the day. Men who had slept deeply all night would wake to this sound without quite registering it, the way you cease to hear the rhythm of your own breathing. In the afternoons, when the fighting, if there was fighting, had drawn back from the plain and the two sides had retreated each to their own walls and ships, the camp entered its longest, softest hours. Men sat together in small groups in the shade of their huts or behind the hulls of the ships, doing the unhurried work of soldiers at rest, mending sandal straps with careful fingers, sharpening blades that were already sharp, because sharpening was something to do, playing games of chance with knuckle bones or carved pieces of ivory, telling stories that everyone already knew the endings of, but that were worth the telling anyway for the familiar shape of them. The way a well-worn path is worth walking, not because it leads anywhere new, but because the ground is friendly underfoot. There was music in the camp. This is something that the stories preserve, and it feels entirely believable, because music is one of the things that people reach for when time stretches out long and empty around them. It is said that Achilles himself, in his famous withdrawal from the fighting, sat in his hut with his lyre and sang the deeds of heroes to his companion Patroclus, the two of them passing hours that way, the music drifting out across the shore and mixing with the sound of the surf. Other men had flutes made of bone or reed, and in the evenings these would sometimes be heard, a thin, wandering melody that seemed to belong to no particular tradition, made up in the moment, following no law but its own mood. The evenings were the best part, or so it seems from where we sit now, looking back across all that distance. When the sun went down behind the hills of the Troad, those rounded, darkening hills that the Greeks could see every day from the plain, beautiful and slightly mournful in the way that hills always look when they are someone else's country. The fires came up all along the shore, hundreds of them, flickering in the great arc of the camp, and the men gathered around them and ate whatever there was to eat, and drank the wine they had, which was mixed with water in the old fashion, and talked, or did not talk, or simply sat and watched the flames. The wine would have been dark and thick, carried in great clay jars with pointed bases that were driven into the earth to keep them upright, sealed with cloth or pitch. When it was good, it was very good, and when the supply was low, there was an undercurrent of something like anxiety in the camp, because wine was not merely pleasure, but part of the ritual of being alive in that world, part of the ceremony of eating together, of pouring a little out for the gods before you drank, of making the firelit circle of the meal into something consecrated and proper. Odysseus would have known all of these evenings. Every one of them across those 10 long years, he would have sat at fires very much like this one, his dark eyes catching the light, listening more than he spoke, because Odysseus was a man who understood that listening was its own form of intelligence, that the man who stays quiet learns more than the man who fills the air with his own voice. And yet when he did speak, at the council meetings that the Greek leaders held to argue over strategy and grievance and the endless difficult question of what to do next, his words had a quality that the poets remembered long afterward as persuasive beyond any reasonable explanation, as though the words themselves were weighted differently than ordinary words, landed with a different kind of gravity. He would have watched the fires of Troy from the plain. On clear nights those fires were visible on the walls, a warm, trembling glow above the stone, and men in the Greek camp would sometimes stop and look toward them without quite knowing why, the way you might look at a lighted window in a house you cannot enter. Troy had held for 9 years by the time the 10th year came, and the people inside its walls had their own fires, their own ordinary evenings, their own bread and wine and music, and the strangeness of that, of 2 whole worlds of ordinary life pressed up against each other across a strip of plain, each side having their evenings and their mornings, each side sleeping and waking and mending things. That strangeness was simply the texture of those years, too large to think about, and so mostly not thought about, absorbed into the daily routine, the way very large things are absorbed when you live among them long enough. The sea was always there, of course. Every morning when the Greek warriors woke and pushed back their cloaks and reached for water to wash their faces, the sea was the first sound they heard. That long, unhurried exhalation of water over pebbles that repeats itself so many thousands of times a day that it becomes not a sound but a condition, like light, like temperature. Men from landlocked places in Greece had perhaps never really heard the sea before they came here, and now it had worked its way so deeply into them that some, it is said, would find it hard to sleep in silence when they finally went home. But the 10th year was different from the others. Something in the air of it was different, some quality of attention or of pressure that even men who could not have explained it would have felt, a sense of the long patience of the siege drawing toward something. The ships were still pulled up on the shore. The fires still burned each night in the same places. The bread was still made the same way, and the wine was still poured, and the flutes still wandered through their own small melodies. But underneath all of it, the 10th year moved differently, and it was Odysseus sitting quiet at his fire who first understood what the 10th year required, and what he would build with patience and with timber, and with that particular quality of mind that had always set him apart from other men. For now, though, let the fire be enough. Let the shore be what it is. Dark water, pale shingle, the warm orange core of the flames, and the breathing of the camp around you. 10 years of ordinary evenings settling into the ground like rain. The smell of wood smoke reaches you first, drifting in across 10 years of salt and siege, carrying with it the ghost of pine resin and sawdust, and something older, something that belongs to the dark interiors of forests rather than the open plain before a city's walls. It is the smell of a plan taking shape, of a mind working quietly in the space between what is possible and what has never been tried before. Settle in now, and let that smell carry you gently into the last long night of Troy. For 10 years the Greeks had camped upon the Trojan shore, and in all that time the great walls had not fallen. The walls themselves, it was said, had been built by gods, by Poseidon and Apollo in some older age, when the boundary between the divine and the mortal was more porous than it would later become. And perhaps that was why no human weapon had yet found a way through them. Spears had broken against them, ladders had been pushed aside, seasons had turned, one after another, autumn into winter into spring, into the long honey-colored summers, and the walls had simply stood there in the way that ancient things stand, patient and indifferent and enormous. And so the Greeks, who had tried everything that strength and courage could devise, turned at last to something else entirely. The story goes that it was Odysseus who conceived it, though some accounts whisper that the seer Calchas had a hand in its design, or that Athena herself breathed the idea into being on some quiet night when Odysseus sat alone by his fire, staring into the flames with that particular stillness that came over him when he was thinking most deeply. However it came to him, the shape of the idea was this: not a weapon to break the walls, but a gift large enough to enter through the gates, carrying within it everything that the walls had kept out: a horse, made of wood, hollow. The craftsman Appius, who was said to be the finest builder among the Greek host, set to work with timber drawn from the fir trees of nearby slopes, and for some days the sound of his tools rang out across the camp, in a rhythm that the soldiers found strange and calming both at once. The steady knock of mallet against chisel, the long smooth rasp of a plane moving with the grain. The horse that took shape was enormous, built to a scale that dwarfed any animal that had ever actually lived, its legs thick as young trees, its flanks broad and smooth, its hollow belly large enough to hold a chosen company of men in the close dark silence that would be required of them. It was beautiful in the way that useful things made with great care are sometimes beautiful, neither ornamented nor plain, simply the right shape for what it needed to do. The Greek fleet then did something that must have bewildered the Trojans who watched from the walls. It withdrew. The ships were dragged down to the water and sailed away toward the horizon, disappearing around the curve of the island of Tenedos, which lay close enough to shore that the fleet could wait there, hidden from view, until the agreed signal came. The camp was struck. The fires were extinguished. The long, sprawling city of tents and cookpots and memories that had grown up on the Trojan shore over 10 years simply ceased to be, leaving behind only the great horse standing on the empty plain and a single Greek soldier named Sinon who had agreed to be left behind. What the Trojans made of this sight when they came out from their gates in the morning light is something the old poets describe with a kind of tender attention, because the Trojans who walked out across the plain that day were a people who had lived under siege for a decade, and were now suddenly blinking in the unfamiliar openness of a world that appeared to have given them back to themselves. They walked carefully at first, as people do when they cannot quite believe that something has ended. They spread across the empty ground where the Greek camp had been, touching the places where fires had been, finding small objects left behind, feeling the strange quiet that follows the withdrawal of something enormous. And then they came to the horse. There was debate, as there always is, when something unprecedented stands before a group of people asking to be understood. The Princess Cassandra spoke against it, as she spoke against so many things that were fated to happen, regardless of her warnings, her voice rising with an urgency that went unheeded, in the way that her voice always went unheeded, because she had been given the gift of true prophecy, paired with the curse of perpetual disbelief. The priest Laocoon also warned against it, and the story goes that he flung a spear at the horse's flank, and the spear struck with a hollow sound, a resonant thud that should perhaps have told the Trojans something important, though in the event it told them nothing at all. Then the sea sent serpents, great coiling creatures that came in from the water and silenced Laocoon in a way that seemed to the watching Trojans like a divine sign, a punishment for impiety, a signal that the horse was sacred and should not be harmed. And Sinon spoke to them. He told a story, carefully prepared, full of the kind of convincing detail that only someone like Odysseus would have thought to include, and by the end of it, the Trojans believed that the horse was an offering to Athena, that it had been built large deliberately so that it could not be brought inside the city, because if it were brought inside the city, Troy would become invincible. It was exactly the kind of story that works, not because it is plausible, but because it tells people what they already want to believe. They breached their own walls to bring it in. That night, Troy celebrated. After 10 years, the gates were opened, the enemy was gone, The long, grinding weight of the siege had lifted, and the city filled with something it had nearly forgotten how to be, joyful. Wine was brought out. Fires were lit in the streets. Not the careful defensive fires of a besieged city, but the worn, generous, unnecessary fires of celebration, burning simply because the night was there to be made bright. The story goes that the feasting went on until deep into the darkness, until the city was quieter than it had been in a decade, until the fires burned low and the wine had done its slow and thorough work, and the people of Troy lay sleeping in the easy way of those who believe the danger has passed. In the belly of the horse, the chosen men waited. It is difficult to imagine what those hours were like, crouched in the close, warm dark, with the sounds of celebration gradually softening beneath them, the movement of the horse through the streets, and then the stillness, the smell of pine resin, and the breath of other men, and the necessity of absolute silence. Odysseus was among them. Menelaus was among them. They waited in the way that the plan required, patient and still, while outside the fires of Troy burned down from celebration into embers. And then the trapdoor opened, and the men descended on ropes into the sleeping streets, and the signal fires were lit on the headland of Tenedos, and the fleet came back across the dark water, and the gates of Troy were opened from the inside at last. What followed is something the poets describe in images of light and shadow, torches moving through streets, the great city unwinding from itself in fire and grief, flames climbing the sides of buildings that had stood for generations, the long gold light of the burning spreading outward across the plain and reflecting in the water of the straits, so that the whole world seemed for a time to be made of fire. Troy, which had withstood 10 years of siege and the efforts of the greatest heroes the Greek world had known, came undone in a single night. By morning it was ash and silence. The Greeks gathered on the shore among their ships in the early light, and there must have been a strange hollowness to that morning, the strange hollow feeling of an objective so long pursued that it has come to feel permanent, suddenly achieved. The war was over. The ships could be loaded, the men could go home, but the way they had won mattered to the gods, and the way they left the burning city mattered more than any of them yet understood. The sea lay before them, wine-dark and enormous, full of distances that none of them could quite yet measure, and somewhere in the arithmetic of what had just been done, a reckoning was being prepared, patient as stone, by a god who had watched what happened in the precincts of his temples and had not forgotten. The fire on the shore burned lower as the first ships put out, and the smoke of Troy drifted inland, and the long homeward journey was about to begin. Let that smoke drift gently overhead as you rest now, and know that the sea and all its wandering can wait until tomorrow night. The fires are still burning as the chapter opens, not the great catastrophic fires of the night before, but the quieter, slower fires of morning, the kind that smolder long after the blaze has had its way, curling thin gray smoke up into a sky that has turned, with the first pale hours, from black to violet to a color something like the inside of an oyster shell. The plain of Troy, which for 10 long years held the tents and the cooking fires and the restless homesick Greeks, is now a different kind of landscape entirely, soft with ash, quiet in a way that only places of great upheaval can be quiet, as though the earth itself is resting after what it has witnessed. The wind moves across it from the sea, carrying salt and cinder together, and where the great walls of the city once stood, there are now only broken lines against the early sky, like the remains of something written and then erased. The ships are being readied, all along the broad curve of the beach, for as far as the eye can follow in the haze of dawn and smoke, the Greek host is moving with the particular energy of men who have waited so long for a thing that now the thing has come they can hardly believe it is real. There is the groaning of hulls being dragged across wet sand, the slapping of ropes against timber, the sound of men calling to one another across the noise of surf and wind, voices carrying the names of harbors and headlands they have not seen in a decade, spoken now not as longing, but as plan, as possibility, as something almost within reach. The wine-dark sea stretches out before them, vast and indifferent, the same sea that brought them here and that must now carry them home. Among those preparing to sail is Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, the man the stories most often place at the center of things, though on this particular morning he moves quietly enough, overseeing the loading of his own dark ships, 12 of them, each one carrying men who have grown older and warier and more deeply desirous of home with every year that passed on this foreign shore. His face by now is a face that has seen much, creased by sun and sea wind, bearing the particular stillness of a man who has learned to hold his thoughts behind his eyes. He watches the burning city across the plain. It is said he feels something complicated in that watching, something that is neither pride nor guilt exactly, but some mixture of both that has no simple name, the feeling of a man who has done what needed doing and knows nonetheless that what needed doing was a terrible thing. And here is where the trouble begins, or rather, here is where the trouble that was always waiting beneath the surface of things begins to make itself known. The story goes that in the chaos and the darkness of the city's fall, acts were committed that offended the gods. Not Odysseus alone, but the Greeks as a whole, men who in their victory forgot the sacred obligations that victory demands. Temples were entered that should not have been entered. Altars were passed without the proper reverence. The goddess Athena, who had been among the most steadfast of the Greeks' divine supporters, turned her face away. And when Athena turns away, the sea itself becomes uncertain. And then there was Poseidon, the shaker of the earth, the dark god who holds the deep waters in his keeping, whose moods move through the ocean floor and up into the waves that break against every shore of the world. Poseidon had his reasons for anger, reasons that the stories preserve in different ways. There was, it is said, the matter of the great walls of Troy, which Poseidon himself had helped to build long generations before, and which now lay broken. There was the dishonor shown at altars, and there was, above all, the particular offense that would follow Odysseus personally across all the years and all the waters of his wandering. An offense not yet committed as the ships depart, but already waiting in the dark of an island cave not far ahead. But that is a story for the next night's dreaming. What matters now is the departure itself, the moment when the last ropes are loosed, the last men wade through the shallows and haul themselves over the sides of the black-hulled ships. The moment when the oars are shipped and the sails, where there is wind to fill them, are let out and catch the morning air. The beach of Troy, which has been a home of sorts for 10 years, falls away behind them. The figures of other departing Greeks grow small and then smaller still across the water. And ahead lies everything, the whole complicated wine-dark god-haunted sea, full of islands and currents and creatures and choices, stretching between this ruined shore and the rocky green coast of Ithaca. The early sailing goes well enough, or well enough by the standards of what is coming. The fleet moves together for a time, then begins to scatter as different kings set different courses for different homes. The way a single flock of birds will separate into smaller and smaller groups as each bird peels away toward its own particular tree. Odysseus keeps his ships together, his 12 hulls moving in loose formation through seas that are, for the first days, calm enough. The surface of the water catching the light in the way it does in the shallower Aegean, shifting from blue to green to something almost silver in the afternoon, with the islands passing at intervals on either side, dark shapes of pine and rock, sometimes the white gleam of a village visible on a hillside, the distant lowing of cattle carried across the water. He makes offerings. The stories agree on this. Odysseus is a man who understands the importance of the proper gestures, who knows that the gods must be acknowledged, that the sea must be respected. Wine poured over the side of the ship, dark wine spreading and thinning in the green water, the color of it fading quickly until it is gone. Prayers spoken quietly at the prow, words for safe passage and favorable winds, for the health of the men, for the sight of Ithaca's familiar stone. He stands at the prow sometimes in the evenings, watching the sun go down behind whatever island or empty horizon lies to the west. And somewhere behind those eyes of his is the image of his wife and his son and the gray-green hills of home, held there with the careful steadiness of a man who has learned not to let hope burn too bright, because hope that burns too bright makes the waiting unbearable. The sea does not yet show its full displeasure. That is the nature of the kind of curse that moves through these old stories. It does not announce itself with a single storm and have done. It settles in. It becomes the texture of the journey itself. It is present in the wrong winds and the unexpected landfalls, in the poor decisions that seem reasonable at the time, in the way that home keeps receding, no matter how steadfastly the prow is pointed toward it. Poseidon is patient, the way the sea is patient, the way deep water is patient, carrying its purposes in currents that move far below the surface, felt only when they pull the ship sideways and you realize you are not where you thought you were. The men row when there is no wind, and bail when the sea comes over the sides, and eat their dried fish and their hard bread, and talk in low voices at night about what they will do when they reach home, the fields they will plant, the children they have not yet met, the beds they remember with a tenderness that surprises them by its depth. Odysseus listens to these conversations without always joining them. He is thinking, always thinking, the mind that earned him the name of many turns and many counsels, working through the shapes of things, trying to read the sea ahead the way a man reads a face. The stars come out above the ship at night, clear and very bright on the open water, far from any shore, and the sound of the hull moving through the darkness is a slow rhythmic sound, the sound of timbers and water finding their old agreement, the sound that has accompanied every sea crossing since the first brave soul pushed out from shore and trusted the deep. The men sleep by turns. The watch keeps his eyes on the horizon and the sky, and the wanderings have begun. They are barely yet aware of it. The shape of what is coming has not yet shown itself, but somewhere out there in the dark water ahead, the first of the long chain of islands and encounters and impossible passages is already waiting, patient as the sea, patient as the god who set this whole unwinding in motion. For now, though, there is only the ship and the stars and the slow sound of waves and the men sleeping their exhausted sailor's sleep as the world of Troy fades further and further behind them, and whatever lies ahead remains still hidden in the soft dark of a night on the open sea. The ships moved out from the burning coast of Troy on a wind that smelled of ash and salt, and for a little while the men believed the worst was already behind them. It is worth lingering on that feeling for a moment, the way it must have settled over the fleet like a warm and welcome thing. The relief of men who have survived something enormous and are now at last turning their faces toward home. The oars lifted and fell in their long, slow rhythm, and the sea received them without complaint, that wide and ancient sea the color of dark wine when the light falls on it at a certain angle in the late afternoon. The hulls cut through it cleanly, and the spray rose at the prows in soft white arcs, catching the light, falling back, catching it again. The men who were not rowing sat with their backs against the thwarts or the mast steps and let their eyes drift closed. Some of them, it is said, were already dreaming of home, the particular smell of their own portyards, the sound of their children's voices, the weight of a cup they had not held in 10 years. Odysseus sat at the stern of his own black ship and watched the coastline of the Troad grow thin and then disappear entirely into the haze of distance. And if he felt anything as it went, the story does not easily tell us what it was. The first landfall was not peaceful. The winds carried the fleet southwest, down along the coast of Thrace, and brought them at last to the country of the Cicones, a people allied in some older arrangement with the city they had just destroyed. The story goes that Odysseus and his men came ashore at a place called Ismarus and sacked the town there, one of those acts of raiding that the men of that age seemed to consider as natural and unremarkable as fishing. They took what the town held, and then, instead of sailing immediately away as Odysseus urged them to do, the men sat down on the beach and began to feast. They slaughtered sheep and cattle. They opened jars of wine. The smell of roasting meat drifted inland on the evening air, and the night deepened around them, and still they feasted. What Odysseus felt in those hours, that particular exhaustion of a man who sees what is coming and cannot prevent it, is something we can only imagine as we let these old scenes wash quietly past us. He urged his men to depart. They did not listen, and in the morning, with the first gray light, the Cicones returned, having spent the night gathering their neighbors and their allies from the interior, men on horseback with long spears, men who knew this ground and moved across it with the easy confidence of those who are fighting close to home. The battle on the beach was not long, but it cost Odysseus 6 men from each of his 12 ships before the survivors could pull the vessels back into the water and away from shore. The sea closed around them again, and this time there was no feeling of relief in it. The men who had been lost were given to the deep water, with whatever mourning the departing fleet could manage, and the ships sailed on, heavier for what they carried now, not treasure but grief, and the particular silence that falls among men after they have watched companions die. The sea has a way of changing its temper without warning, and it changed now. A storm came down from the north, with the kind of sudden ferocity that the Aegean can produce in certain seasons. The wind shifting, and then strengthening until the sails had to be taken in, and the men bent over their oars in the driving rain, unable to see the other ships, unable to see much beyond the next wave rising darkly ahead of them. For 2 days, it is said, the storm held them, and the men lay in their ships with the sailcloths pulled over them for shelter, and the water sloshing around their knees, and waited for the world to become manageable again. On the 3rd day the storm broke. The sea smoothed itself out with a kind of indifference, as though nothing had happened, and the scattered ships found each other again on the bright water. They made offerings then, pouring wine into the sea, speaking words that the waves swallowed without ceremony, and sailed on. The next shore they found was gentle. It is called in the old story the land of the lotus eaters, and scholars have placed it in various corners of the Mediterranean without ever quite agreeing, which perhaps is appropriate, since it is the kind of place that exists most fully in the imagination. What the story tells us is this, that some of the men went ashore, and that the people they found there were not hostile, were in fact generous, and offered them the lotus flower to eat. Think of a late afternoon on a quiet island, the light turning amber, the air very still, the sound of water somewhere close but not urgent. Think of sitting down in that light and feeling every worry you have ever carried begin slowly to dissolve, not violently, not dramatically, but gently, the way mist lifts from a hillside as the morning warms. This is what the lotus was said to do. The men who ate it forgot where they were. They forgot, more importantly, where they were going. They forgot about home, not with grief or with any sense of loss. They simply forgot, the way you sometimes forget in a very deep sleep, who you are and what your life contains, and the forgetting is not painful at all. Odysseus had to drag these men back to the ships by force, weeping, and bind them under the rowing benches until they were far enough from that shore that the feeling faded. The story presents this as something he does quickly and decisively, but if we let ourselves imagine the full weight of it, men who have survived 10 years of war, who were weeping not from pain but from the simple desire to remain still and untroubled, whom he had to carry away from the one thing they had found that felt like peace, then it becomes something more complicated and more human, and perhaps something we understand a little as we lie here in the growing quiet of our own night. And then came the Cyclops. The island they found next was green and wild, rich with untended vines and goats that moved unhunted across the slopes, and across a narrow channel from it lay a larger, rockier coast from which at night smoke rose from cave mouths high in the hillside. Odysseus took 1 ship and 12 of his best men. The story does not tell us why he went, when the safer course would have been to remain on the green island and sail on, and cross the channel to investigate. The cave they entered was enormous and empty of its inhabitant. It smelled of curdled milk and wet wool and old smoke. Great wheels of cheese rested on the racks along the walls. Tens of lambs and kids stood in the corners. The men wanted to take what they could and go immediately back to the ship. Odysseus wanted to wait to see who lived here, to receive perhaps the gifts of hospitality that the laws of the gods demanded a host provide. What came home that evening was a being larger than anything a man is built to stand comfortably before. The Cyclops, Polyphemus, this is the name the story gives him, filled the cave the way a weather system fills a valley, and when he rolled the great stone across the entrance and turned to find men huddled against the far wall, there was a long moment of terrible stillness, a moment in which the fire he had lit caught and grew and threw its orange light across everything, across the stone walls and the hanging fleeces and the small pale faces of the men who now understood completely what it meant to have no way out. What happened in the days that followed in that cave, the men who were eaten, the wine, the name that Odysseus gave himself, the sharpened stake, the blinding, all of it is a story for the wakeful mind, a story of cunning and desperation and survival. For now, in this quiet hour, it is enough to know that Odysseus and his remaining men did emerge from that cave, did return to their ship, did sail out across the dark water with the sound of the Cyclops' roaring fading behind them, a sound like the mountain itself was grieving. They found the other ships on the green island, and they cooked the goats they had brought, and they sat around the fires until morning, and the sea lay quiet around them on all sides. There would be more to navigate ahead, winds still to be reckoned with, shores still to find in the turning dark, but for now the ships rested on their moorings, and the men rested too, and the flames burned down to coals, and the coals breathed softly in the night air coming off the water, small and warm and steady, the way fire always is when the worst of the storm has passed. The ships were moving again, and the sea had grown quieter, and for a little while, just a little while, it seemed as though the worst of things had passed. After the darkness of the Cyclops' cave, after the long rocky scramble back to the ships and the sound of boulders falling like terrible rain into the water behind them, the surviving crew had rowed in silence, bending low over the oars, not speaking, barely breathing, until the coast of that blinded giant's island had faded entirely from view. And now, days out from that shore, the Aegean light was gentler again, the kind of pale gold that spreads itself slowly across the water in the late afternoon, and the waves moved in long, easy rhythms beneath the hulls, and the men had begun, slowly, cautiously, to breathe more freely. The wind filled the sails with a sound like a slow exhalation, a soft, continuous rushing that was, in its own way, almost like rest. It is said that they came to a floating island, though the word floating carries with it a strangeness that is difficult to resolve entirely, and perhaps what the old stories mean is simply that the island seemed to move, seemed to shift its position in the haze, never quite to sit still in the way that solid land ought to sit. Its name was Aeolia, and the walls that rose around its shores were walls of polished bronze, gleaming in the sunlight with a brightness that seemed almost unearthly, almost too smooth, too regular, to belong to anything made by ordinary hands. The story goes that Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, had been given this island as his domain by the gods themselves, and that he lived there with his wife and his many children in a kind of permanent, well-provisioned ease, feasting and telling stories and governing the great invisible currents of air that move across the world. Odysseus was welcomed there as a guest, and this mattered enormously in that world, where hospitality was not merely a kindness, but something closer to a sacred obligation. He and his men were given food and wine and a place to sleep, and for a full month, 30 slow days, they rested on Aeolia, and the sea wind moved around the perimeter of that bronze-walled island in quiet circles, as though it too were content to wait. Odysseus told Aeolus everything, or nearly everything, the war, the wooden horse, the long burning of Troy, the journey homeward, and all that had befallen them along the way. He is described in the old telling as a man who knew how to speak, how to shape a story, how to choose the words that would make a listener lean closer. And Aeolus listened with the particular attention of someone who understood that a good story was itself a kind of gift. When the time came for Odysseus and his men to leave, Aeolus gave him something remarkable. He gathered all the wild and wandering winds, the blustering ones, the sharp, cold ones, the sideways driving ones that scatter ships and tangle rigging and push a vessel miles off course in a single afternoon, and he bound them inside a great leather bag, a bag made from the hide of an ox, tying it closed with a silver cord, and he placed this bag in the hold of Odysseus's ship. He kept back only the gentle west wind, the one that would carry them straight and steady toward Ithaca, and he set it blowing softly against the sail, and the ship began to move, and the crew felt the familiar lean and surge of a vessel finding its direction. For 9 days they sailed like this, 9 days of clean, purposeful travel, and the wind was kind, and the stars at night were clear, and Odysseus himself sat awake at the tiller for all of it, unwilling to sleep, not trusting the journey to anyone else because he had learned, expensively, that the moment you allowed yourself to trust completely was often the moment something quietly unraveled. By the 10th day they could see it. They could actually see it, the coastline of Ithaca, low and familiar on the horizon, the particular shape of its hills, the color of its rocky shores, and the men who had been watching quietly from the benches began to murmur among themselves, and some of them wept in the soft way that exhausted people weep, without drama, just the steady overflow of something that had been held in too long. And this is where Odysseus finally let himself rest. He lay down near the stern, and his eyes closed, and he slept. And this moment of earned and understandable surrender is where everything came undone. The crew had been watching the leather bag for the entire journey. It sat in the hold, tied with its silver cord, and it was plainly not empty, plainly not nothing, and the men had been talking to one another in low voices across 9 days of sailing, letting the thought grow and settle and take shape. That bag must contain treasure. Gold, silver, some gift from Aeolus that Odysseus had kept for himself and told no one about. They had worked hard, they had suffered, and here was their captain sleeping, and there was the bag, and Ithaca was right there on the horizon, close enough almost to smell. One of them loosened the silver cord. What happened next was not gradual. The winds did not ease themselves out politely. They burst free all at once. The whole contained chaos of them, shrieking and howling, and driving the ship immediately backward, immediately away from that coastline that had been so close, so visible, so almost reached. And the water rose in steep, confused waves, and the sail was useless, and the oars were useless, and the men clung to whatever was fixed and solid while the world came apart around them in a roaring gray-green fury. Odysseus woke to this. He woke to the sound of everything he had almost had being taken away again, and the story goes that in that moment he considered simply stepping over the side, letting the sea have him, because the grief of it was very nearly more than a person could be asked to hold. But he did not. He held on, and the winds blew them all the way back to Aeolia, all 9 days of distance, undone in a single terrible night. And in the gray morning they found the bronze-walled island again, and dragged themselves ashore, and Odysseus went to find Aeolus and ask for help, and the conversation was brief and painful and final. Aeolus refused. He would not give the winds again to a man so clearly cursed by the gods. He told Odysseus to leave, and there was no anger in it exactly, but there was something final, something closed, and the ships pushed off from Aeolia for the last time, and headed out onto the open water with no helpful wind at all, only the oars, and the men bent to them in silence. What followed was harder and darker, and this is where the story becomes heavy in the way that only exhaustion can make a story heavy. After 7 days of rowing, 7 days of aching arms and salt-cracked lips, and a horizon that yielded nothing, they came to the land of the Laestrygonians, and if you have been listening quietly to these chapters night by night, you will already sense from the way the telling slows here that this is not a place of welcome. The harbor they entered was ringed with high cliffs, and the water inside was very still, unnaturally still, and the ships of the fleet rowed inward and drew close together. And only Odysseus, perhaps by instinct, perhaps by some older and harder learned caution, kept his own ship back, tied at the entrance to the harbor, outside. The Laestrygonians were enormous, and what happened inside that harbor was swift and merciless and terrible, and the old poem does not linger on it. It simply tells us that the people of that place threw boulders from the cliff tops and speared the men in the water like fish, and that Odysseus, watching from outside the harbor, cut his ship's rope with his sword and shouted to his crew to row and not look back. And they rowed, and behind them every other ship of the fleet was gone. One ship remained where once there had been 12. The crew rowed in silence across the gray water, and no one spoke, and the oars rose and fell, and the sea received each stroke without comment, without comfort, without anything except its ordinary indifferent vastness, spreading away in every direction, under a sky that was beginning, very slowly, to lighten toward evening. They had nowhere particular to go. They only went forward, because forward was the only direction that remained, and somewhere ahead, still invisible, still unknown to them, an island waited where a fire burned in a stone hearth, and something like shelter was possible, for a time, before the road continued on. Let that image settle gently as you rest now. One small ship on a wide sea, moving toward a shore where warmth is waiting, where the story slows and breathes, where there is time to stop and eat and sleep, as you are sleeping now. The sea had been quiet for a long time when the ships finally found the shore. After the horror of the Laestrygonians, after the crushing weight of all that had been lost, the screaming, the stones, the ships broken apart like toys in the hands of giants, there was only one vessel left, and it carried men who had forgotten, for a while, how to speak. They sat at their oars with hollow eyes, and moved the blades through the water by habit alone, by the deep animal memory of their arms. And the sea accepted them without ceremony, guiding them at last toward a forested coastline that rose gently from calm water, and showed no sign of danger, no sign of welcome, no sign of anything at all. Just trees, just green, just the low sound of waves finding the shore in the same slow rhythm they had kept since before any man had thought to sail. Odysseus let his crew rest for 2 full days on that beach, and the story goes that he could hear somewhere in the trees beyond the tideline the distant singing of a woman's voice, though whether it was birdsong or something more he could not yet say. The smoke that rose above the forest was thin and pale and gave nothing away. There was the smell of the sea, as always, salt and cold iron, and beneath it something else, something green and warm and herb-sweet, like a garden no one had tended or neglected, a garden that had simply grown itself into its own perfection. On the 3rd day he divided his remaining men into 2 groups, and it was the company led by his second, Eurylochus, that went first into the trees. The forest of Aegean, as it has come to be called, was not like any other wood. The trees did not crowd or tangle. They rose clean and tall, and their leaves moved in a breeze that seemed to come from somewhere other than the sea, something gentler, something that arrived without explanation and departed the same way. The men who walked beneath them found that their fear slowly eased, not because anything reassured them, but because the forest itself seemed to absorb anxiety the way good earth absorbs rain, quietly, completely, leaving the surface smooth. The birds were abundant and completely unafraid of human footsteps. That alone should perhaps have given the men pause. At the center of the island, or what felt like the center, there stood a house built of polished stone, and around it in the pale morning light there paced lions and wolves, who did not attack and did not flee, but only looked at the approaching men with something like recognition, with amber eyes full of a memory that seemed older than wolves ought to carry. It is said that these animals were men, once, wanderers who had arrived before, sailors from ships whose names no one now remembers, though whether that story is true in its particulars, or simply true in the way that certain dreams are true, carrying meaning even without proof, is not for any of us to say with certainty. The woman inside was named Circe, and everything the old stories say about her agrees on at least this much. She was not cruel in the way of monsters, and she was not kind in the way of ordinary people. She sat at a great loom and wove cloth of such extraordinary fineness that the cloth itself seemed to give off light. Or perhaps it was simply that the room she sat in was full of light, firelight and lamplight, and the particular golden quality of late afternoon pressing through high windows, and everything in that room seemed to glow from within. She sang as she worked. Her voice was the thing Odysseus had heard from the beach. She invited the men inside. She gave them food and wine mixed with something the old poets called a pharmacon, a word that means both medicine and poison, depending entirely on the one who uses it. And when they had eaten and drunk, the men of Eurylochus's company found themselves changing, though the story goes that they did not feel it happening, that the transformation was gentle and dreamlike, that it felt perhaps like falling asleep, like the edges of the world softening, and the body becoming something it had always secretly been. They became pigs. They kept their human minds inside their pig bodies, which is perhaps the cruelest or the most interesting part, depending on how you think about such things. And Circe led them to the sty and gave them acorns, and they were for the moment contained. Eurylochus alone did not go inside. He waited at the threshold, feeling something he could not name, something like the feeling before a storm, and he turned and ran back through the singing forest to the beach. And when he reached Odysseus, he could barely speak for weeping. What happened next is the part the old poems linger over most lovingly, because it is the part where Odysseus, alone, walks back through the trees, and on the way he meets a young man who offers him a small dark flower with a white root, a thing called moly, which will protect him from the transformation, though where such a flower grows and whether any botanist has ever found it is a question that the world has been asking gently for several thousand years. The young man had golden sandals and a particular quality of stillness that suggested he was not quite as mortal as he appeared. But Odysseus had long since learned not to press too hard on the question of who exactly was walking beside him on difficult roads. He went to Circe's hall. He ate her food, he drank her wine, and when she raised her wand and spoke her words, and waited for him to become something small and bristled, nothing happened, and Odysseus rose from his chair with his sword drawn, and something passed between them in that moment. Recognition, or respect, or simply the acknowledgement between two very intelligent people that neither of them is going to easily get the better of the other. Circe, it is said, smiled. She restored the crew. She brought them back from the sty and rubbed their skin with another oil, and they became themselves again. And the story goes that they came out weeping, and that Circe's expression as she watched them was complicated, as though she had forgotten that transformation could be reversed, or as though reversal was something she found more interesting than the original change. And then they stayed, a full year on Aea, and the old poems do not apologize for it and do not explain it away, and perhaps that is the wisest thing they do in the whole long account. Sometimes an island holds you, sometimes after unimaginable loss, all those ships, all those men, all the long years since the towers of Troy first appeared on the horizon. A human being needs to put down their oar and sit in a place that is warm and lit and full of food and music, and simply be alive in it for a while. Circe fed them, she sang. The fire in her great hall was always lit, and the food was always good, and the herbs in her garden gave off their warm, complicated smell through every window and every hour of the day, and the lions and wolves lay peacefully in the courtyard and made soft sounds in their sleep. Odysseus and Circe spoke long into the nights, because she was one of the few people he had ever met who was, in her own way, as complicated as he was, as many-layered, as difficult to fully know. She knew things, in the way that certain island women in the old stories always know things, not because they have seen the future, but because they understand, with great clarity, how the world tends to move, how certain journeys must go, what lies on the far side of choices not yet made. It was she who told him gently, sitting by the fire with her hands in her lap and her voice low and even, that the road home would not be direct, that there was a place he would need to visit before he could go anywhere, a place at the edge of the known world, at the rim of the great ocean, where the light was always dim and the dead gathered like mist in the hollows of the earth. She said it without drama, without the quality of a warning or a threat. She said it the way one traveler tells another about a difficult pass through the mountains, not to discourage, but simply because the pass is there and must be crossed. The crew learned the news in the morning. Some of them wept again, but there were ships to prepare, and Circe helped them prepare, and the wind she promised came at dawn, as she had said it would. On the morning they left, the fire in her hall was still burning. The smoke rose straight and pale into a sky that had not yet decided what color to be, and it drifted slowly westward, thinning as it went, the way all warmth eventually thins at the edges of places where we have been briefly but genuinely at rest. The sea received them again, as it always had, dark and wide and patient, carrying them forward toward the world's far edge and whatever waited for them there in the quiet and the cold. The ship moves before dawn, while the stars above the water are still sharp and cold, each one reflected in the black surface of the sea, as though the world has been turned upside down, and Odysseus sails not across the ocean, but through the sky itself, the oars dipping quietly into what might be heaven, or might be the deep, depending on how long we have been awake and how tired your eyes have grown. There is no wind to speak of, only the soft creak of timber and the slow, rhythmic breath of the crew, men who have rested on Circe's island long enough that their muscles remember what work feels like, though perhaps none of them have spoken aloud about where they are going, because some destinations are easier to approach if you do not name them too directly in the dark. Circe has given them her instructions in a voice that did not waver, and those instructions have been folded carefully inside Odysseus, like a letter he does not yet want to read. He stands at the prow and watches the darkness ahead, and the darkness is not threatening, not precisely, but it is absolute in a way that ordinary darkness never quite manages to be. The sea here, as the hours pass, seems to grow heavier, the color of it deepening from the familiar wine-dark shimmer to something closer to the shade of old iron, and the air that comes across the water carries the smell of deep cold, of stone that has never seen the sun, of water that has come from somewhere so far down that it has forgotten what warmth is. It is said that the land Circe directed him toward lies at the very edge of the world, where the river ocean circles everything that is known and beyond which the light simply stops, as though someone has drawn a careful boundary and told the sun it need not trouble itself past this point. The story goes that the men Odysseus sailed with could feel the change in the air long before they saw any change in the landscape, a kind of pressure behind the eyes, a heaviness in the chest that was not grief exactly, but was related to it, the way that the smell of rain is related to the feeling of sadness on a gray afternoon. They rowed on, because Odysseus asked them to, and because there was nothing else to do, and the sea continued to carry them forward. When they land, it is on a shore that is neither welcoming nor terrible, simply gray and flat and very still, the kind of stillness that exists in places where time moves differently, where an afternoon might stretch for what feels like a season, and a season might pass before you have noticed a single thing change. The poplars here are tall and colorless, and the willows trail their long fingers into water that barely moves, and the sound that reaches Odysseus as he steps onto the gray gravel is not the crashing of waves, but the low, distant murmur of rivers meeting, the dark rivers that flow through the world beneath the world, and even standing this far above them, he can feel their cold rising through the soles of his feet. He does what Circe told him to do. He digs a shallow trench in the cold earth and pours into it the offerings she specified. Honey first, then sweet wine, then water, then a scattering of white barley, and finally the warm blood of the sacrificed animals. And even as the dark liquid spreads into the pale soil, the murmuring around him changes, deepens, becomes the sound of movement, as though the air itself has begun to breathe, and then they come. The dead, it must be said, are not frightening in the way that stories of the dead are sometimes frightening. They do not rage or moan or claw at the living. They drift, is the word for it. They drift as mist drifts over low water in the early morning, purposeful in the way that mist is purposeful, moving always toward the warmth, toward the blood, toward the last faint pulse of the world they remember belonging to. They crowd without crowding, fill the space without pressing, and their eyes, such as they are, hold the particular expression of people trying very hard to remember something they know they once knew perfectly. Odysseus holds them back, as Circe instructed, holds them from the trench until he has spoken with the ones he has come to find, and the first shade to reach him is one he did not expect, a young man from his own crew named Elpenor, who had died not in battle, not at sea, but in the careless way that death sometimes comes for the young, falling from the roof of Circe's hall in the dark before departure, too drowsy and too unlucky to catch himself. He asks Odysseus simply, gently, to remember him, to go back and give him the burial that was not given, to plant his oar above his grave so that those who come after might know a sailor rested there. And there is something in the smallness of this request, this very human wish to be remembered and properly laid to rest, that settles in the chest like a stone laid carefully on still water. Then comes Tiresias, the great blind prophet of Thebes, who even in death carries his golden staff and his unhurried manner, and who tells Odysseus what the sea ahead of him holds, the further trials, the things he must navigate and the things he must not do. And among these, the most important is a warning about the cattle of the sun god, gleaming herds that must not be touched, must not be harmed, must be passed through the way you pass through someone else's sacred place, with your hands folded and your eyes forward. Tiresias also tells him that home is possible, that Ithaca exists and waits, though the road there is not short and not without its costs, and Odysseus listens the way a man listens to a doctor who is telling him something he both needs and dreads to hear. Very still, very quiet, his breathing carefully controlled. But it is the shade of his mother that undoes him. She comes to the blood and drinks, and for a moment simply looks at him, and he had not known she was dead. He had left her living when the ship sailed for Troy, had thought of her sometimes in the long years on the plain, the smell of bread in her kitchen, the sound of her voice in the rooms of the house on Ithaca, and to see her here, in this gray and borderless place, is to understand something about time and absence that no amount of wandering can really prepare a person for. She tells him about Ithaca. She tells him gently that his father Laertes grieves in the old orchard and will not come down to the city, that Penelope waits and weeps, and holds the household together with a patience that is, by now, becoming its own kind of heroism. She tells him that she herself did not die of anything dramatic, only of missing him, of the long longing that sits in the body like a splinter too deep to reach, and she says this without accusation, simply as a fact, the way the dead can sometimes speak of things that would wound the living into silence. He reaches for her 3 times, as the story goes, and 3 times she passes through his hands like cool air passes through an open window, present and then not present, warm and then not warm. And the grief of this, the particular grief of trying to hold someone who cannot be held, drifts out across the gray water and the gray shore and settles into everything around him. Agamemnon, who tells him in the flat voice of the permanently deceived what it is to be betrayed in your own home, in your own bath, on the day of your homecoming. Achilles, bright and fierce even here, who says a thing that has been repeated for as long as stories have been told, that it is better to be the lowest of the living than the king of all the dead. And there is no bitterness in his voice when he says it, only the clear-eyed recognition of what light costs and what its absence means. Ajax stands apart and says nothing, the old quarrel over Achilles' armor still sitting between them like a wound that never quite healed. And Odysseus looks at him across the gray space and does not try to bridge it, because some silences deserve to be left as they are. Eventually he turns back toward the ship, and the crew rows in silence for a long time, the cold shore receding behind them into the fog, and none of them speak of what they have seen or heard or felt on that still and airless beach. The oars move through the water, lifting small dark drops that catch what light there is and hold it for a moment before letting it go. And the ship moves forward, as ships do, carrying its living cargo away from the place where the dead drift and murmur and remember what warmth once felt like. The sea ahead, as the darkness begins to ease towards something resembling morning, holds the glimmer of a distant shore, and somewhere on that shore there are voices that carry across the water with a beauty so absolute it is difficult to describe as anything other than a kind of light, a light for the ears, a brightness that the listening cannot help but move toward. And Odysseus, standing again at the prow, already knows what those voices are, because Circe told him, and he is already thinking, in the careful and unhurried way that is particular to him, about how a man might hear something beautiful and survive it. The ship moves before dawn finds it, sliding out from Aia's sheltered cove while the stars are still thick overhead, and the water holds that particular darkness which belongs neither to night nor to morning but to something older than either. Circe has spoken her counsel, and it sits in Odysseus's chest like a stone warmed at a hearth, heavy, necessary, strangely comforting in its weight. He knows what lies ahead now, or as much as any mortal can be said to know the shape of a sea that does not hold its shape for long. The oars dip and rise, and the sound of them is the only sound in all that wide and breathless world, a soft percussion keeping time against the silence. She had told him of the Sirens first, and it is said she spoke of them the way one might describe a beautiful illness, something that enchants precisely because it destroys, something that calls to the deepest and most private hunger of the listening mind. They sing, Circe had explained in her low and unhurried voice, and what they sing is everything you most wish to hear. Not simple flattery, not empty melody, but the specific and personal truth of your own longing turned into sound. A man who hears them forgets the sea, forgets the ship, forgets his name and his home and his reason for sailing, and he leans toward the singing the way a flame leans toward air, until there is nothing left of him but the leaning. Odysseus had listened to this and made no sound, and then he had asked how to pass them. Now, in the faint gray hour before sunrise, with the stars softening at their edges and the water beginning to show the first ghost of silver, he gathers his crew and tells them what Circe has told him. He does not tell them everything, the particulars of what the sirens sing, the way their music reaches into the private chambers of a man's heart. He tells them only what they need to know and what they need to do. He takes the great cake of beeswax that Circe pressed into his hands at parting and works it soft between his palms, and then he goes from man to man, stopping at each one, pressing the softened wax gently into the cups of their ears, his hands moving with a careful tenderness that he does not name. When he has done for every man, he returns to the mast and says, "Bind me to it. Bind me with as many ropes as you have, and do not loosen them, no matter what I say, no matter what I command. If I beg, if I weep, if I order you with every name I know, do not loosen them." And the men nod, their faces grave, and they bind him, and the ship sails on. The island appears out of morning mist, the way a thought appears in the first moments after waking, gradually, without drama, present before you have noticed its arrival. It is smaller than you might expect, low-lying, pale in the early light, and from it comes a meadow, and the sound of what might at first be wind moving through tall grass, a soft and undulating sound that is not quite music yet. Odysseus, lashed to the mast, closes his eyes and opens them again, and watches the island grow closer. And then the singing begins in earnest. It is said that no human language can adequately describe what the Sirens' song does to the ears that receive it. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Some experiences belong entirely to the body and cannot survive translation into words. What can be said is this: Odysseus wept. He wept and he shouted, and he strained against the ropes until the ropes cut into his arms, and he used every word he knew for release, for mercy, for obedience, for love. He looked at his men, and their faces were turned away from the island, eyes fixed on the horizon ahead, ears stopped with beeswax, hearing nothing, not the sirens, not their captain's cries. They rowed steadily, and they were, in that moment of their deafness, the most merciful men he had ever known. And the island fell behind, and the singing thinned and grew distant, and at last stopped, the way pain stops. Not all at once, but in receding layers, each one a little less than the last, until you realize you cannot remember exactly when it ended. When they cut him free, his wrists were marked with the rope's impression, and he stood at the rail for a long time without speaking, looking at the water, breathing. But Circe had told him, after the Sirens, the passage narrows, and the narrowing is of two kinds. The first passage, she had said, is called the Wandering Rocks, and ships that attempt it are ground to splinters. She had counseled him away from that route entirely, toward the strait where two great threats stand on either side of the water, like doorposts of a door that no man would willingly walk through. On one side, Scylla. On the other, Charybdis. Circe had described Charybdis first, because Charybdis is the kind of danger that is at least comprehensible. A vast whirlpool, a swallowing, a place where the sea opens 3 times each day and draws everything on the surface down into its black throat, and then throws it back up in a boiling chaos of foam and wreckage. She had described it with the directness of someone who has watched it from a safe remove. "Do not look at Charybdis too long," she had said. "Keep to Scylla's side, and row hard, and do not stop." She had described Scylla differently, and in her voice when she did, there had been something that was not quite sorrow, but was adjacent to it, a kind of acknowledgement that some truths cannot be softened into bearable shapes. Scylla is a creature who lives in a cave in the cliff face, concealed in shadow, and she has 6 heads on long necks, and each head has 3 rows of teeth, and she reaches down into passing ships and takes what she finds. Circe had told him plainly, "You will lose 6 men. There is no stratagem for Scylla. There is no cleverness that outpaces her, no sacrifice that satisfies her, no prayer that redirects her hunger. She reaches down and she takes 6 men, and the ship passes through, and that is the passage." Odysseus asked if he might arm himself, might stand at the rail and fight, and Circe had looked at him with an expression he could not name. Not pity exactly, not fondness exactly, and said only, "Row hard, and do not look up." He looked up. He could not stop himself from looking up, and he saw her. Or rather, he saw what the reaching was, 6 long necks descending from the shadow of the cliff, the speed of it, the terrible efficiency. He heard his men calling his name, calling it in a way they had never called it before, not with authority, not with need, but with something more intimate and more desperate than either. And he could not reach them, could not cross the deck in time, could not have crossed it even if there had been time, because the arms of Scylla were not a thing that could be outrun on a ship's planking. He stood at the mast, his hand braced against the wood, and the 6 men were lifted, still calling, into the cliff's shadow, and then the ship was through the strait, and the water opened out again on the other side, and it was over. He does not speak of what their faces looked like in the telling. He describes the passage, the mechanics of it, the geography. He does not speak of the faces. There is an island after, bright and warm, and filled with the lowing of great cattle, the island of Thrinacia, the cattle of the sun god Helios, enormous and beautiful and absolutely forbidden. Circe had said it plainly. Tiresias had said it plainly. Do not touch the cattle. Rest if you must. Reprovision if you can from what the sea provides and what the ship carries, and then sail on. Odysseus had intended to sail past entirely, to not even set foot on the island's shore. But his crew was grieving and exhausted, and the winds turned against them in that same hour, and the sea would not permit departure, and they landed. They stayed longer than they meant to, as people so often do on islands that are beautiful. And then their provisions ran low, and then the winds still did not come. And then one dawn while Odysseus slept, the story goes that he had gone inland to pray, to put some small distance between himself and whatever might happen, as though distance were a kind of innocence. His men killed the cattle. They roasted them on the shore, and the smoke rose into a sky that heard everything, and what heard it was not a sky inclined toward mercy. The winds came after that quickly, and they sailed. And for a little while it seemed as though the sea was simply the sea again, wide and indifferent and passable. And then the storm came. When it had passed, the ship was gone and the sea was very quiet, and only Odysseus remained, holding to a plank among the wreckage, breathing, drifting, the water carrying him now, as water carries everything in the end, without preference, without pity, toward whatever shore is waiting. The waves rocked him gently in the darkness, and somewhere very far away, too far to see, a light was burning. There is an island at the center of the sea. Not at the center of any map that any sailor has ever drawn, not marked by any lighthouse or remembered by any harbor pilot trading stories over wine, but at the center in some older, deeper sense, the way a dream has a center that you feel without being able to name it. The Greeks called it Ogygia, and the story goes that it floated there, unhurried and unchanging, in a part of the ocean where the water itself seemed to forget which direction it was meant to be moving. The waves that reached its shores arrived softly, as though they had been traveling for so long that all urgency had dissolved out of them, leaving only the gentle habit of motion, the slow exhale of water against warm stone. This is where the sea brought Odysseus when everything else was gone. He did not arrive with ceremony. He arrived the way a piece of driftwood arrives, tumbling, salt-soaked, emptied of intention, after the last of his ships had been broken apart by the storm that Zeus sent down upon the wine-dark water, after the last of his companions had been swallowed by waves that rose and fell with the indifference of mountains. He had lashed himself to the wreckage of his mast, and floated for days, it is said, with no land in any direction, and no sound but the water moving around him, that vast and patient sound, the same sound the sea makes, whether there is anyone alive to hear it or not. And then the current shifted, as currents do, with no explanation, and the broken mast drifted toward the green shore of Ogygia, and the man clinging to it dragged himself up onto the sand, and lay there breathing. Calypso found him there. She was a goddess, daughter of the great Atlas who holds the sky upon his shoulders, and she had lived alone on her island for longer than the word alone usually means. The story goes that she was neither cruel nor careless. She was simply what she was, an immortal presence in an immortal place, tending her garden and her cave, and the quiet days with the patience of someone who has never needed anything to end. When she found the man on her shore, she brought him inside, out of the wind, and gave him fire and food and dry clothing, and she watched the life come slowly back into him, the way you might watch a lamp recover its strength after a draft has nearly put it out. And so began 7 years. 7 years is a number that sits differently in an immortal mind than in a mortal one. For Calypso, 7 years was a season, a breath, a short chapter in a story with no final page. For Odysseus it was everything. It was Telemachus growing from a boy into a young man without his father watching. It was Penelope waking each morning to another day of waiting on an island that was growing louder and more difficult around her. It was the slow accumulation of days that a mortal body counts without meaning to, the way hair grows and lines deepen, and the particular quality of urgency that lives inside a human life keeps pressing forward even when the body is still. Let us rest a while in the texture of those years, because there is a kind of beauty in them, even in the sadness. The cave where Calypso lived was not dark. This is the detail the ancient poets were careful to include, as though they understood that we might imagine the wrong thing, some cold and dripping underworld hollow. No, the cave was hung about with the smell of cedar and sweet burning wood, a fragrance that drifted out across the whole headland, so that any sailor passing close enough might have caught it without knowing what it was, something warm and resinous, carried on the sea breeze like a memory of warmth. Alder trees and black poplar and fragrant cypress grew around the entrance, tall enough that birds nested in their upper branches, owls and falcons and the long-winged seabirds who travel great distances and seem to belong to no particular place. Vines trailed across the cave mouth, thick with grapes. 4 springs ran nearby, close together, their water clear and cold, their sound a constant soft accompaniment to everything that happened on that hillside, a sound like the quietest kind of thinking. Inside, the fire burned. It burned in the way that fires in such places seem to burn, steadily, without drama, giving off its warmth and its shifting amber light and that particular quality of softness that firelight lends to the edges of everything it touches. Calypso wove at her great loom and sang, and the singing filled the cave the way smoke fills a room, gradually, gently, until it is simply part of the air. It is said her voice was beautiful in the way that certain kinds of weather are beautiful, completely, without effort, without any awareness of being observed. And Odysseus sat at the cave's entrance and looked out at the sea. This is the image that the old story returns to again and again, as though it is important, as though the poet understood it to be the heart of everything that happened on that island. The man sitting at the threshold, not inside the warm cave with its fire and its singing, not outside on the open hillside, but at the edge, looking out, looking at the horizon. The sea from Ogygia was always bright in the mornings, the story goes, that particular blue-silver that open water turns when the sun is still low and the air is clean, and nothing is moving on the surface for as far as the eye can follow. He watched that brightness every morning. He looked for ships that did not come. He looked in the direction where, if you could see far enough, and the curvature of the water did not intervene, Ithaca might be. Calypso loved him. The poets say this plainly without ambiguity, and there is no cruelty in the way they say it. She loved him, and she offered him immortality, offered to make him ageless, deathless, permanent as the island itself, and he refused. Gently, carefully, with the kind of honesty that belongs to someone who knows the offer is genuine and is grateful for it and still cannot say yes. He told her, it is said, that he knew Penelope was mortal and therefore lesser in the technical accounting of things, smaller, subject to time in ways a goddess is not. And yet he wanted to go home. He wanted it the way the body wants air, not as a preference, but as a necessity, the obscure and non-negotiable need that underlies everything else. She wept when he said this. The story notes it without lingering, a small detail, dropped into the narrative like a stone into still water. And then the story moves on. But let us not move on quite yet. Let us stay with the image for a moment. The goddess weeping in her fragrant cave, the fire burning steadily behind her, the sound of the 4 springs outside continuing regardless, because water does not pause for grief. There is something in that image that belongs to all of us, the understanding that love alone is not always enough to make a place into home, that home is something stranger and more specific than love, that it involves the smell of particular soil and the sound of a particular harbor, and the faces of people who know your name and your history and your father's name before you. The gods convened eventually, as gods do, and it was decided that Calypso must release him. Hermes came across the water. You can imagine the journey, the messenger god skimming the surface with his golden sandals, the sea spray brightening around him, and delivered the word of Zeus. And Calypso received it with the grace of someone who has known for a long time that a thing was coming and has only been hoping to be wrong. She helped Odysseus build his raft. She gave him provisions, good bread and water and wine, and cloth for a sail, and instructions for reading the stars. She let him go, and he sailed away from the island at the center of the sea, away from the cedar smoke and the singing and the steady fire, toward all the difficulty and uncertainty and mortal beauty of the life that was waiting for him. The water around Ogygia, the story goes, was very still after he left. The 4 springs kept running. The birds kept nesting in the cypress and the alder. The fire in the cave kept burning, because in a place like that, the fire does not go out simply because there is no one left to need its warmth. There are other shores ahead, bright, busy shores where music drifts across garden walls, and a gentle people will offer our wanderer rest before the final passage home. Let those shores come to you now in the softness of sleep, where all arrivals are peaceful and all harbors are calm. The torches along the harbor wall of Scheria are being lit, one by one, as the evening deepens into the color of a ripe plum, and the smoke from each small flame rises in a thin, unhurried line toward the first faint stars appearing above the island. There is almost no wind tonight. The water in the harbor lies so still and so perfectly dark that each torch finds its twin below, a second fire burning calmly in the depths. And if you were to stand on the long stone quay and look down, you might believe for a moment that the sea itself had swallowed a whole city of lights and was keeping them warm somewhere beneath the surface, patient and undisturbed. This is Scheria, the island of the Phaeacians, and it exists at a kind of remove from the ordinary world, a place that the story goes the gods themselves once placed far from quarrelsome men, set apart like a jewel wrapped in cloth, kept safe from the roughness and noise of the heroic age. You have arrived here gently, carried on the same current that carried Odysseus, and there is nothing tonight that asks anything of you except to rest and to look, and to breathe slowly in the salt sweet air that moves off the sea in long, unhurried pulses. The city itself is built with a quiet confidence, the way a place is built by people who have never known a siege, whose walls exist for beauty rather than for war. The streets are wide enough that 2 wagons might pass each other with room still to spare, and the stone used in the building is pale, almost the color of cream, so that even now, in the last light of the evening, the walls and archways seem to hold a little of the afternoon inside them, still faintly warm to the touch. Gardens run alongside many of the houses, not wild gardens, but tended ones, the kind where someone has walked every morning for many years making small and careful decisions, and the result is an abundance that feels both generous and serene. Pear trees and pomegranate trees stand in rows that are never quite perfectly regular, allowing the eye to move through them easily, and figs hang heavy and dark among broad leaves, and grapevines climb without urgency along low walls, their tendrils curling loosely around whatever they find. It is said that on this island the seasons do not behave quite as they do elsewhere, that something of the gods' favor keeps the fruit ripening in a long, slow sequence that never entirely stops, so that there is almost always something ready to be gathered, something sweet and ready and waiting in the quiet green shade. The great house of King Alcinous stands somewhat apart from the other buildings, approached by a path that has been smoothed and leveled with evident care, bordered on either side by tall bronze doors set into their frames with such precision that they open and close without sound, which is perhaps one of the details that makes this place feel faintly different from the rest of the world, faintly more considered, as though whoever built it understood that sound itself is a kind of texture, and that the absence of certain sounds can be a form of welcome. Inside, the walls are hung with fabrics woven in colors that catch the lamplight and return it softened, deep reds and blues that have something of the sea in them at different hours, and the lamps themselves are set at intervals that create pools of warm illumination, between which there are gentle shadows, not frightening shadows but restful ones, the kind that seem to complete the light rather than oppose it. Gold and silver dogs, cast by some ancient and gifted craftsman, sit at either side of the entrance. It is said that these were made by Hephaestus himself, set there to guard the house, and never grow old, never tire of their watching, and there is something quietly wonderful in the idea of them. 2 bright, faithful animals standing at their post through all the years of feasting and music and rest. The Phaeacians have gathered for the evening meal, as they do with a comfortable regularity that speaks of a life organized around pleasure and fellowship, rather than necessity and fear. They are a seafaring people, the finest sailors in the world, some would say, capable of navigating at night by instinct alone. Their ships finding harbors in darkness, the way a man finds his own doorway without a lamp, simply because he has walked there so many thousand times that his body remembers the way. But tonight the ships are all at rest, drawn up along the harbor or riding quietly at anchor, their dark hulls rocking almost imperceptibly with the long, low breathing of the sea, and the men who sail them are here in the hall, reclining on benches covered with soft cloth, their cups filled and their faces easy with the ease of people who are home. There is a low murmur of conversation, not loud, not urgent, the kind of conversation that happens between people who know each other very well and have no particular need to impress, who can let words come and go lightly, like the small wavelets that touch the harbor wall and retreat again with no more ambition than to have touched it. And then the music begins. The bard Demodocus sits in his accustomed place, and the room becomes, without any announcement or ceremony, something slightly different from what it was before, slightly more gathered into itself, the way a room becomes when a single voice begins to shape the air. It is said that Demodocus received his gift from the Muse herself, who loved him and took from him his sight, but gave him in return the kind of deep, sweet knowing of the human heart that sighted men might spend their whole lives searching for without finding. He plucks the strings of his lyre, and the sound that comes out has a quality of gentle inevitability, as though the notes were always there, resting in the air of the hall, and he is simply the one with the ability to find them and release them one by one into the lamplit warmth. He sings of heroes, of great and distant deeds, and the Phaeacians listen with the particular attentive pleasure of people who love a story the way they love a landscape, not for any practical use it offers, but simply because it is beautiful, and because beauty, here in Scheria, is understood to be among the most serious of life's considerations. The queen already sits beside Alcinous, her hands folded in her lap, with the composure of someone who has long understood her own authority and no longer needs to assert it. She watches the bard, and then watches the guests, and then watches the fire that burns in the long central hearth, and her watching has a quality of intelligence and patience that is entirely comfortable with itself, the kind of watching that misses nothing, but displays nothing. Among the Phaeacians, it is to Arete that a stranger in need is advised to speak first, because it is she whose judgment sets the tone of how a guest will be received. And there is in this arrangement a kind of wisdom that the story seems to offer quietly, without emphasis, simply as a detail of how this particular well-ordered place works. The servants move between the tables with a practiced lightness, refilling cups from tall pitchers, setting down plates of food at intervals, their movements so familiar that they have become nearly invisible, part of the background hum of the hull, the way the soft creak of the ships at anchor is part of the background hum of the harbor. Outside, the night has fully arrived now, warm and soft, the sky above the island so clear that even the faintest stars have made themselves known, and the torches along the quays still burn without flickering, their reflections still resting in the dark water below, patient and doubled, as though the sea wishes to understand what fire is and has decided that the best way to learn is simply to hold it close and look at it for a very long time. Somewhere in the gardens, a night bird is singing, a small and intermittent sound between the phrases of the bard's music, and the two sounds do not compete, but coexist in the easy way that things coexist in places where no one is hurrying and nothing is yet demanded. The smell of the gardens drifts in through the open doorways, the smell of ripe fruit and night-blooming flowers, and the distant underlying salt of the sea that is, on this island, always present beneath every other smell, the way the sea is always present beneath every other thought, of a man who has sailed it long enough to have it become part of him. Let the music settle over you now, and the warmth of the hall, and the gentle company of people who have made a good life in a sheltered place, and understand that the point of a good life is to share it with those who arrive at your threshold with nothing left. Somewhere in this hall tonight, there is a stranger with salt still in his hair and grief still sitting quietly behind his eyes, and the hospitality he finds here will restore him enough to take one more step, to speak his name and his story, to accept the Phaeacians' offer of passage across the dark water toward the shore that has been waiting for him, the shore of his own island, which we will reach together slowly in the time ahead. For now, rest here in the light, breathing in the sweetness of the Scherian night, and let the torches burn their quiet doubles down in the still water of the harbor, burning without hurry. The ship has gone now, slipped back beneath the dark water without a sound, and there is only the shore. It is earliest morning on Ithaca, that particular hour when the sky has not yet chosen between night and day, when the color of the air is something between gray and silver, and the faintest possible blue, a color that has no name in any language, but that the body recognizes immediately as the hour of returning. The sea lies flat and breathless in the harbor of Phoreus, that sheltered cove on the eastern side of the island, and the water there is so still that it mirrors the pale sky almost perfectly, so that if you were to stand at the water's edge and look downward and outward at once, you might not be entirely certain which surface was solid and which was reflection. A white-armed olive tree leans over the mouth of the cave at the head of the cove, as it has always leaned, patient and silvery and indifferent to the passage of years. And at the edge of this perfect stillness, sitting on the sand with his back to the cave, there is a man. He is alone. The Phaeacian sailors who brought him here from the shining island of Scheria laid him gently on the sand while he slept, placed his gifts of bronze and woven cloth in the shadow of the olive tree, and departed without waking him, their oars drawing the ship out through the quiet water as carefully as a needle drawn through silk. So he slept there for a little while longer, this man who has not slept on the soil of his own island in 20 years, and the sea breathed softly around him, and the olive leaves moved just barely in the first stirring of morning air. When he woke, he did not know where he was. This is perhaps the most melancholy detail of the whole long journey, and it deserves a moment of quiet attention. After everything, after the storms and the monsters, and the 7 years of impossible stillness on Calypso's island, after the raft and the shipwreck, and the long swimming through cold water, after the kindness of the Phaeacians, and the hall full of firelight and stories, after all of that, when Odysseus finally set foot on the shore of the place he had been trying to reach for 10 years, he did not recognize it. Athena had laid a mist across the island, the old stories tell us, gently obscuring the familiar headlands and the paths he had walked as a child. And so for a few long and disorienting moments, the man who had navigated by stars across the open ocean sat on the sand of his own home and believed himself to be somewhere else entirely, somewhere strange, somewhere not yet safe. It is said that he wept. He looked at the harbor and did not know it, looked at the trees and the cliffs above, and the pale morning sky, and he put his face in his hands and mourned, because after everything, after all of it, he believed he had been deceived and set down on a foreign shore. The gifts beside him seemed to mock him. The sea offered nothing but its usual indifference, its surface catching the first pale light and holding it without warmth. But then Athena came to him, as she so often came, in disguise, appearing as a young shepherd standing on the beach with a fine cloak over his shoulders, and that particular quality of stillness that distinguishes the divine from the ordinary, even in borrowed form. And when Odysseus, still cautious, still careful after all this time, invented a story for this stranger, because of course he did, because caution and invention were as natural to him as breathing, the goddess smiled, and the mist lifted, and the harbor of Phoreus appeared to him in the soft growing light, exactly as he had always known it. He kissed the ground. The story tells us this plainly and without elaboration, and there is no need to add anything to it. He kissed the earth of Ithaca, this man who had sailed through every kind of water the world could offer, who had spoken with the dead and heard the Sirens and slept in the bed of a goddess. He pressed his mouth against the soil and felt 20 years dissolve into something smaller than a breath. Athena helped him carry his gifts into the cave, tucked them safely out of sight, and then she did something characteristic and practical and rather wonderful. She changed him. She touched him with her golden wand, as the old stories describe it, and the sea-worn man with the broad shoulders and the sailor's bearing became something altogether different. An old beggar, thin and stooped, his skin weathered and creased, his eyes still bright but now set in a face that no one would look at twice. Wrapped in dirty rags that smelled of the road, a battered leather satchel hanging from a stick across one shoulder. He was unrecognizable. He was invisible in the way that only the very poor and the very old are truly invisible, which is to say, completely. And so, in this borrowed shape, Odysseus began to walk into his own island. The path from the harbor of Phoreus up through the interior of Ithaca is not a short one, and he walked it slowly, as an old man would walk, feeling the stones and roots through the thin soles of his beggar's shoes, listening to the island as he moved through it. The olive trees here were the same trees he had always known, their trunks twisted into those ancient shapes that olive trees achieve over centuries of slow growth, their leaves showing silver undersides in the morning breeze. The air smelled of thyme and of rock warmed by sun, and somewhere above him on the hillside, a goat was moving through scrub, the small percussion of its bell the only sound besides the wind and his own footsteps on the path. He was making for the hut of Eumaeus. Eumaeus was his swineherd, though to call him merely that is to diminish him considerably, because in the world of the Odyssey, a loyal swineherd of a great household was a man of genuine standing and trust, responsible for the care and management of enormous herds, a man whose daily decisions carried real weight. Eumaeus had been with the household since before Odysseus left for Troy, since before the war was even imaginable, and he had remained loyal through all the long years of the suitors. Occupation of the palace, tending his pigs on the hillside above the town, with a quiet, stubborn faithfulness that asked nothing in return and expected nothing. It is said that Eumaeus had been born a prince somewhere far away, taken by sea raiders as a young child and sold into service, and that the story of his life was thus a kind of mirror to Odysseus' own wandering, though far less celebrated and far less remembered. He had built his hut himself, the story tells us, made it strong against wind and weather, and kept it with a simplicity and order that spoke of a man who had learned to take care of himself without being noticed. The hut appeared through the trees as the morning light strengthened, and around it the pens spread outward in irregular rings, each one holding a portion of the great herd, and the sound of the pigs came softly across the hillside, that low communal murmur of large animals at rest, oddly peaceful in the early air. Dogs came first, 4 of them, large and quick, and not at all welcoming, and the old beggar sat down in the path very calmly and waited, because an old beggar would know to wait, and because even through his disguise, something in his posture communicated a kind of patience that the dogs, after their initial alarm, seemed to find acceptable. Eumaeus called them off from the doorway of the hut. He stood there in the pale morning, shading his eyes against the light, looking at this ragged stranger on his path, and before he had spoken a single word of welcome or inquiry, he said, "Come inside, and let me give you something to eat, because whatever you are carrying and wherever you have come from, you look as though the road has been long." This is the kind of man Eumaeus was. Odysseus came inside and sat down on a low bench near the fire that Eumaeus kept burning in the center of the hut, and the warmth of it moved over him slowly, working its way into the cold that 20 years of ocean had laid into his bones. Around them the sounds of the hillside continued, the pigs and the wind through the olive branches, and the soft knock of the door against its frame, and the smoke rose from the fire in a slow pale column and drifted through the opening in the roof. He was home, not in his palace, not in his bed, not yet anywhere close to the life he had left and longed for, but he was on Ithaca, sitting by a fire, eating bread from the hands of an honest man who had stayed. And for this particular morning, that quiet fact was enough to rest in. There were other fires burning somewhere on the island in the great hall, where the suitors gathered each evening to fill their cups and crowd the tables that had never been intended for them, where Penelope moved through her long days with a composure that had cost her more than anyone knew. But those fires were far away for now, and the morning was still, and the warmth of the swineherd's hearth settled gently around the returned man like something he had almost forgotten he knew how to feel. The loom stands near the window, where the light is best. It has stood there for years now, patient as the island itself, its upright beams worn smooth at the places where hands have rested, where a woman's palms have steadied the frame through long mornings and longer afternoons. The threads strung between the beams are fine wool dyed in pale ochre and the deep rust red of Ithacan earth. And when the sea breeze moves through the upper room, it lifts the loose ends very slightly, so that the whole surface of the cloth seems for a moment to breathe. Penelope has come to know every thread of this loom, the way a sailor knows every plank of a familiar ship. She knows which rows are tight from the days when her hands moved with purpose, and which rows are loose from the mornings when her mind was elsewhere, following some memory out across the water. It is said that she began the great shroud in the 3rd year after the fleet departed for Troy, though the story goes that even before that, she had found herself drawn to the loom in the hours when sleep would not come. Weaving had always been a kind of thinking for her, a way of setting one thread of thought alongside another until a pattern emerged that her mind alone could not have found. She had learned it young, in her father Icarius's house on the mainland, and she had brought that skill with her across the water to Ithaca when she came as a bride, hardly more than a girl, to a stone palace above a harbor that smelled of pine resin and salt. She had loved the island quickly, the way one sometimes loves a place that asks something of you. Ithaca is not gentle. It is steep and rocky, and the soil is thin, and the wind that comes down from the hills in autumn has an edge to it. But there is something in the quality of its light in the early morning, a clarity that seems to rinse the world clean, and Penelope had recognized it as a place where things were seen truly, where pretense did not last long against the hard honesty of the stone and the sea. She had understood, she thought, why Odysseus loved it so fiercely, why he spoke of it when they lay talking in the dark, the way other men might speak of a god or a parent, with that particular tenderness that belongs to things that have shaped you without knowing they were doing so. And then he was gone, and she was left with the light and the stone and the sea, and no voice in the dark beside her. The early years were full enough with the business of ruling, because that is what she did, though she was careful in how she named it. She spoke always of managing the household, of keeping things in readiness for the king's return, and this was true, but it was also much more than that. She heard disputes between landowners. She authorized the slaughter of livestock. She oversaw the stores of grain and oil. She kept the accounts that tracked what left the palace and what came in. She did all of this with a steady quietness that the servants and the minor lords learned quickly to read as authority, though she never raised her voice and rarely gave a direct command, preferring instead a way of speaking that suggested the correct course so naturally that those around her arrived at it believing it had been their own idea. This was, people said, a very Ithacan way of ruling. Others might have said it was a very Odyssean way. Telemachus grew beside her through those years, first a soft and solemn infant, then a quiet boy who sat for long hours at the window watching the harbor, then a young man whose face she sometimes caught at a certain angle and felt the air leave her chest, because the angle was his father's. She loved him with a depth that sometimes frightened her, and she worried about him with the particular worry of a mother who knows that her child is growing into a world that is not yet safe, that may never be safe, that depends entirely on the return of a man whose fate she does not know. She did not know. That was the thing she learned to carry as the years accumulated, the not knowing. She had no news of Troy for long stretches, and then a ship would come with word of some battle, some small victory or loss, and her mind would immediately begin the work of placing Odysseus within it, of calculating his distance from the danger, of imagining his face by firelight in some camp far across the water. She imagined him often by firelight, because the image had a warmth in it that kept the darker possibilities at a distance. The suitors came first as a trickle, young men from the island and the neighboring kingdoms who had heard that the queen of Ithaca was perhaps a widow, that perhaps the king would not return, that the kingdom and the woman were both available to whoever made the strongest claim. At first there were only a few, and they came formally, with gifts, and behaved as propriety required. But as the years passed and the trickle became a flood, they settled themselves into the palace with a permanence that had nothing proper about it at all, eating through the storehouses, drinking the wine, filling the great hall with a noise that was the opposite of everything Odysseus had built there. She hated the noise. She had not known before how much she was a woman of quietness, of the soft domestic sounds of the palace at its proper work, the loom and the spindle, the low talk of servants in the kitchen corridor, the sound of the harbor coming through the open shutters at night. The suitors brought a different kind of sound, loud and blurring, full of laughter that had an aggressive edge to it, and it pressed against her in the upper rooms, where she spent more and more of her hours. And so she made the shroud. It is said that when pressed to choose among her suitors, she announced that she must first complete a burial shroud for old Laertes, Odysseus's father, who was aging, and who deserved a proper cloth when his time came. She would make her choice, she told them, when the work was finished. The story goes that she wove through the days and unwove her work each night by lamplight, so that the cloth never grew, never completed, and the suitors could not call the promise fulfilled. 3 years, the old stories say, she maintained this, until a servant betrayed the nightly unraveling, and the game was ended. But this is perhaps too neat a story for what was, in truth, a much larger thing. The weaving and unweaving was real, or so the story goes, but the deeper truth of those years cannot be contained in a single clever stratagem. The deeper truth is that Penelope held the kingdom together by the sheer patient force of her refusal, that she made of her grief not a paralysis, but a kind of discipline, that she found in the daily return to the loom something that was both practical and almost devotional. She was weaving against the erasure of Odysseus, against the suitor's slow assumption that he no longer existed, that his halls were already theirs, that his wife was already a widow. Every thread she set was an act of insistence, a quiet declaration that the story was not finished, that she would not be the one to end it prematurely. She thought of him most clearly in the late afternoon, when the light through the window was the color of old bronze, and the sound of the harbor came up the hill, softened by distance, its sharpness worn away until it was almost like breathing, the slow inhale and exhale of a body much larger and more patient than any human one. In those hours she let herself remember freely, without the careful management she maintained in company. She remembered the particular way he had of touching the back of her hand when he was thinking about something else, as though the contact was so habitual it needed no attention. She remembered the smell of his cloak when he came in from the cold, lanolin and wood smoke and the iron salt smell of the sea. She remembered his voice reading the shadows on the wall and making stories out of them for Telemachus when the boy was very small, and the boy's delighted laughter, and the lamplight wavering across all 3 of them while the night gathered outside. The lamp in the corner of the upper room burns low tonight, as it has burned low on so many nights before this one, its flame drawing down through the oil with a patience that seems almost deliberate, as though it too is learning to wait, as though even light has understood that some things cannot be hurried, only held. Tomorrow the palace will stir again, and among its shadows a stranger will move, one who has not yet shown his face in full, one who watches the hall with eyes that miss nothing, eyes that are learning, slowly and carefully, the shape of what must come. For now, though, there is only the lamp, and the loom, and the quiet. The torchlight along the palace corridor breathes and wavers, throwing long shadows across the stone floor, and somewhere deeper in the hall a fire has been burning since before the evening meal, its warmth spreading slowly outward through the great room like something patient that has learned to wait. You have walked a long road to arrive here, through wine-dark water and enchanted islands and years of open sky, and now, at last, the journey turns inward, through a familiar doorway, into a place that should be home, though home is a word that must be earned again before it can be claimed. Odysseus stands at the threshold of his own hall, in the rags of a beggar, and he does not step inside all at once. He lingers at the edge of the firelight, where the darkness of the doorway still clings to his shoulders, and he looks. He has always been a man who looks before he moves, who gathers information the way a careful captain gathers weather signs before committing to open water, and what he sees now requires all of his attention and all of his restraint. The suitors are there, spread across the benches and the rush-strewn floor, reclining with the comfortable ease of men who have decided that another man's house belongs to them. They are loud in the way that emptiness is sometimes loud, filling the space left by the man who should be sitting at the head of the table with their own noise, their own laughter, the clatter of their cups against the long wooden boards. The smell of roasted meat is heavy in the air, and the firelight catches the grease on their fingers, the wine stains at the corners of their mouths, the careless scatter of bones tossed toward the dogs beneath the tables. He watches all of this, and he keeps his face still. This is not easy. The stories have always been careful to say that even Odysseus, who had looked upon the dead in their own kingdom, who had heard the sirens and kept his heart steady, felt something move in his chest when he saw his hall used this way, when he saw the men who were eating through his stores and pressing their suits upon his wife as though the years had dissolved his claim to either. It is said that he pressed his hand against the carved wood of the doorpost for just a moment, steadying himself, before he allowed the mask of the beggar to settle fully over his features, and then he walked inside. The swineherd Eumaeus walks with him, introducing him with the simple, generous words of a man who knows how to treat a traveler, regardless of his clothing, and the suitors look up from their cups and see only what they expect to see, an old wanderer, bent by weather and misfortune, harmless as the ash at the edge of a fire. One or two of them call out with the sharp, thoughtless humor that men use when they want to seem entertaining to each other, and one of them, Antinous, whose name has drifted through these chapters before, like a shadow that keeps returning, speaks with particular contempt. He tosses something toward the disguised Odysseus, not in the spirit of hospitality, but in the spirit of dismissal, and the hall laughs, or some of it does. Odysseus receives this without expression. He is collecting everything, storing it, the way the sea stores the rivers that flow into it, without becoming smaller. There is another moment, quieter and stranger than the rest, that comes while he is moving through the hall. A dog lifts its head from its place beside the doorway, an old dog, his muzzle gone gray, and his eyes grown cloudy with age, lying on a heap of dung, as if the years have reduced him to this last undignified corner. The dog is named Argos, and the story goes that he had been a fine hunting animal in his younger days, before the war took his master away, before the household fell into disorder, and no one thought to look after him anymore. Now he raises his head at the sound of a familiar step, at something in the air that is older than recognition and more certain than memory, and his tail moves once, twice, in the dust. Odysseus sees this and does not stop walking. He cannot stop walking. He is a man in disguise in a room full of dangerous men, and a single crack in the mask would cost him everything. But the story is careful to say that his eyes grew wet as he passed, and that he looked away before anyone could see. Argos puts his head down again after that, and does not lift it again. The fire breathes on. In the days that follow his arrival, and there are several of them, each passing with the slow, careful rhythm of a man playing a long game, Odysseus moves through the household like smoke moves through a room, present without declaring itself. He watches who speaks to whom, which of the servants can be trusted, which of the suitors is most dangerous, and which is merely foolish. He notices the way Penelope carries herself when she descends from her rooms to appear before them, the careful composure she has worn like armor for so many years, giving nothing away, offering nothing that could be taken and used against her. He recognizes this armor because he invented his own version of it long ago, on an island, in a cave, on a raft in the middle of nowhere with the sea pressing in from every side. And then there is Telemachus. The reunion happens quietly, and that quietness is the most important thing about it. There is no announcement, no crowded room, no formal declaration. Odysseus finds his way to his son in a private moment, and Telemachus, who has spent his young life without a father, and who has just returned from his own searching voyage to Pylos and Sparta, looking for news of a man he has never really known, looks at the beggar standing before him and does not immediately understand what he is seeing. And then understanding comes, not all at once but in stages, like the light coming back after a long night, and the boy who had to learn to be a man without any guidance from the man who should have taught him, reaches for his father and cannot quite speak for a moment. It is said that both of them wept, and the story does not apologize for this. They are not weeping out of weakness. They are weeping the way a house weeps when the fire is finally lit again after a long cold season, the wood cracking and the warmth moving outward through rooms that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Odysseus is careful with what he tells his son, and careful with what he asks him. He needs to know who among the servants is loyal, who among the suitors poses the greatest threat, how the palace lies during the night hours, which doors are left open and which are locked. Telemachus answers everything with the precision of a young man who has spent years paying quiet attention to a situation he could not yet change, cataloging details that he did not know he would one day need. They are very alike in this, father and son, and if either of them notices the resemblance, it is not something they say aloud. Some things are understood without being named. The plan that forms between them in that quiet conversation is not spoken at full volume. It is passed like a torch passed from hand to hand in a dark corridor, each piece given carefully, each piece received and tucked away. The great bow is part of it, the bow that has been sitting unstrung in the storeroom for 20 years, the bow that no one in the hall has been able to draw. Penelope, it seems, has announced a contest. perhaps because she feels the walls closing in, perhaps because something in her has sensed, without yet knowing, that the time for waiting is almost finished. Telemachus listens to what his father says about the bow and about what is to happen next, and the torchlight steadies between them, and the fire in the great hall goes on breathing its slow, patient breath. Outside, the night air moves across Ithaca the way it has always moved, across the olive groves and the rocky slopes, and the surface of the water in the harbor, soft and continuous, carrying nothing in particular, carrying everything. The island does not know yet that its long sleep is nearly over. But something in the quality of the firelight inside the hall has shifted very slightly, the way firelight shifts when something new is about to burn. Let that quiet shifting carry you toward rest now, toward the still place behind your eyes where the stories settle. Tomorrow there will be a great bow, and a long haul, and a reckoning that has been 20 years in arriving. But that is for another evening. For now the fire is enough, and the sea is calm beyond the door, and the night holds everything gently until morning. The hall has grown warm with the press of bodies, the torches burning lower now in their iron brackets, casting long amber shapes across the painted walls, and the faces of men who do not yet know that this night will be the last of its kind. The suitors have been feasting for hours, their voices filling every corner of the great room, their laughter bouncing off the stone and cedar, and somewhere beneath all of that noise, there is a quiet that only one man in the room can feel, the quiet of a bowstring not yet drawn, of an arrow still at rest, of a story arriving at its final turn. Penelope has come down from her chambers carrying a thing of great weight and great memory, the bow of Ithaca, they call it, the bow that once belonged to a friend of Odysseus, given in the spirit of guest friendship long ago on the island of Messene, a gift between young men who had not yet learned what the world could take from them. It is a recurved bow of polished horn, dark and smooth with handling, and it has not been strung in 20 years. It has lived in a cedar chest in the storeroom, wrapped in its memories, resting in the dark the way that grief rests when a household has grown used to carrying it. Penelope holds it now with the careful tenderness of someone holding a name she has not spoken aloud in a long time. She stands before the suitors and her voice is even, composed, the voice of a woman who has had 20 years to practice the art of appearing unbroken. She speaks the terms of the contest clearly and without ornament. Whoever among them can string the great bow and send an arrow cleanly through the holes of 12 axe heads set in a line across the earthen floor, that man she will follow from Ithaca, leaving behind the house and the husband she still half believes may return to her. It is said by those who knew her that she did not believe, as she spoke these words, that any man in the room could do it. It is also said, more quietly, that she had already begun to sense something different in the air of the palace that evening, something she could not have named, a stillness beneath the noise that did not belong to the suitors. The axes are set. The torchlight moves across their bronze rings in slow gold waves, and the contest begins. One by one the suitors take up the bow and attempt to string it, and one by one they find that it will not yield to them. A bow like this is not merely a tool. It is a relationship between an archer and an instrument built over years of use, a knowledge carried in the palms and the shoulders and the forearms, and no amount of youth or arrogance or feasting can substitute for that knowledge. Some of the suitors warm the bow near the fire, hoping the heat will soften the horn and make it pliant. They grunt with effort, and their faces redden, and the room fills with the particular silence of men discovering the edges of their own strength. The bow does not care about any of this. It rests in each set of hands and gives nothing back. And in the shadows near the door, watching all of this, the old beggar sits very still. He has been in the hall all evening, patient and unremarkable, the kind of figure that prosperous men learn not to see clearly. He has watched the suitors eat food that was not theirs to eat, drink wine that was not theirs to drink, and fill with noise a house that belongs to someone else. He has watched, and he has said very little, and the torchlight has moved across his weathered face, and found there an expression that is not quite sorrow, and not quite anger, but something older and quieter than either. When at last the suitors have all failed, and the bow has been set aside in something resembling defeat, the old beggar rises and speaks in a voice that asks, gently and with apparent humility, whether he might be permitted to try his hand. The suitors laugh. Some are offended that a beggar should want to hold such a bow, that he should imagine himself capable of what princes and lordly men have just failed to do. It strikes them as ridiculous, and they say so, though some say it with less conviction than others, because there is something about the stillness of this old man that has been quietly unsettling all evening. Penelope says he may try, Telemachus says he may try, and then Telemachus, with a firmness in his voice that has been growing there over the course of many difficult months, suggests that his mother retire to her chambers now, that what is about to happen in the hall is the business of men, and particularly the business of one man. She goes. She does not fully understand why she goes without argument, but something in her son's voice reaches her in a place below understanding, and she withdraws upstairs, and the women draw the doors closed behind her. The old beggar takes the bow. He turns it slowly in his hands, examining it the way a person examines something they know very well after a long absence, looking not for flaws or properties, but for a kind of recognition. He runs his thumb along the curve of the horn. He checks the tips where the string will seat. He does all of this quietly and without haste, and the hall watches him with the peculiar attention that stillness always commands in a room full of noise. And then, with a movement so practiced it looks almost like ease, he bends the bow and strings it, the great recurved horn yielding to him as though it had been waiting. The sound of the string being tested, that single clear resonant note in the torchlit air, is like nothing else. It is a sound that carries its own history in it. It is the sound of a door opening. The arrow slice clean through all 12 axe heads. What happens next is not quick, but it is inevitable in the way that certain things, once set in motion, can only move in one direction. Odysseus sheds his rags. His son stands beside him. The faithful servants, those who have held their loyalty like a small lamp through the long dark years, are positioned at the doors, and the suitors, who have had so many months to consider what they were doing in another man's house, eating another man's food, and pursuing another man's wife, find that the reckoning they perhaps always half expected has arrived at last in the form of a king who looks like nothing so much as a tired old man, until the moment he chooses to be something else entirely. The torchlight is wild and moving through all of this, casting shadows that lunge and settle and lunge again across the walls, and the night presses close around the palace from outside, and somewhere in the harbor the dark water moves quietly against the stones without any knowledge of what is happening in the great hall above it. It takes time. These things always take more time than stories suggest, and when it is over, when the hall is still again, in a different way than it was still before, Odysseus stands in his own house and breathes the air of his own house, and something in him, the part that has been moving for 20 years, moving across every kind of water and through every kind of darkness, that part finally stops moving, not with the sharp feeling of victory, with something much slower and much quieter, the feeling of a man who has arrived somewhere and knows, in the deep, unhurried place beneath all thought, that he has arrived. Eurycleia goes upstairs to wake Penelope, who has been sitting awake in her room because sleep would not come, because something in the house has changed, and the air itself feels different. What Penelope feels when she is told, and then when she sees him, her husband, the real one, not the beggar, and not yet quite the king, just the man she married, is not something the story pauses long over, because some things belong to the two people who share them, and not to anyone else. But she sits with him. They sit together in the firelight, and the night, which has been so long and so full, begins at last to loosen its grip and let the hours through. The torches burn lower and lower in the great hall. The tide moves softly around the island. Somewhere on the far side of Ithaca, the fishing boats are pulled up on the pebbled shore, resting in the dark just as they always have, just as they rested all those years before the war came and took the men who sailed them. And the sea that gave Odysseus his long detour and his longest lessons rolls on in the dark, unhurried, indifferent to endings, carrying its salt and its cold light the way it always has and always will. The next time we gather by this shore, we will let the whole journey settle around us once more. Every island, every sea, every fire, and breathe it all in slowly, the way you breathe in something that has finally, gently come to rest. The sea is quiet now. It settles into itself the way all things do when the story has been told. when the last word has found its place, and the silence that follows is not empty, but full, the way a room feels full after the fire has burned low and the people you love are breathing softly nearby. The wine-dark water lies still beneath a sky thick with stars, and somewhere on its surface, if you look with the patient eyes of someone half asleep, you can trace the long silver thread of a journey that wound through 10 years of war and 10 more of wandering before it came, at last, to rest upon a familiar shore. Let the whole of it come back to you now, gently, the way a tide comes back, without hurry, without effort, simply returning because returning is what tides do. There was a world once, warm and bright, and trembling at the edges with something that felt like myth, even to the people living inside it. A world of islands rising from the blue like the backs of sleeping creatures, of palaces fragrant with cedar and olive wood, of harbors where the oarsmen rested, and the merchants counted their copper, and the poets were already composing lines about men who had not yet done the things the poems described. It was the age the Greeks would always look back upon as golden, or near enough to golden, and at the center of it, small and rocky and impossibly green, lay an island called Ithaca, perched on the edge of the western sea like a shepherd's cloak left out on a hillstone at the end of a long day. And on that island, before any of it began, there was a man. He had his grandfather's cleverness, his mother's quickness, the particular brightness in the eye that belongs to people who are always thinking two things at once. He had a wife whose mind was as finely made as her hands, and a son too young to remember him, and an old dog who would wait with a faithfulness that would one day make even the gods look away in something like shame. He had a kingdom that was small by any reckoning, but was his, entirely and wholly his, and he did not want to leave it. But the world asked him to leave it, and so he went. He went with a fleet that gathered slowly at Aulis, ship after ship sliding into the harbor like beads onto a thread, the oars resting, the bronze catching the morning light, the whole enormous weight of Greek ambition pressing toward a single distant shore. He went and he spent 10 years in the long, slow brotherhood of a siege, eating bread cooked over driftwood fires, sharpening weapons that had not yet been used that day, watching the walls of a city that would not fall, and trying to remember what he was fighting for. He went and he thought, because thinking was what he did, and out of his thinking came a horse made of fir wood and deception, hollow as a promise and full of armed men. And the city that had stood for 10 years fell in a single night of fire and shadow, and the sound of water buckets thrown too late onto walls already lost. And then he tried to go home, but the sea and the gods who moved within the sea had other plans for him, and so the wandering began, one shore giving way to another, in a long, unhurried chain of strangeness and sorrow and occasional wonder. Each island its own small world, each world requiring something of him before it let him pass. There were men made slow and sweet by flowers, who had forgotten that home was a thing worth wanting. There was a cave in a hillside, where one great eye opened in the dark, and the only way out of it was through a name that was not a name. No man, the cleverest kind of lie. There was an island where the winds lived in a leather bag, and the bag was opened by hands too impatient to wait for the harbor that was almost visible on the horizon. There were giants who threw boulders from cliff tops, and an island thick with trees where a goddess moved between the shadows, and men were changed into something that wore their shape, but had lost the particular human sorrow that goes with it. And then, slowly, gently, they were changed back. There was a shore at the edge of the world where the water ran dark and the air tasted of something that had no name. And he stood there in the dimness and spoke to everyone he had lost, his mother, his companions, the great heroes of the war whose stories had already passed into the keeping of the dead. And he learned what he needed to learn and turned back toward the living world, carrying with him the weight of everything he had heard. There were rocks that sang in voices like warm water, and he listened, lashed to a mast, with his ears open and his hands bound, the only man ever to hear that music and survive it, which was perhaps the loneliest kind of gift. There was a passage between a whirlpool and a many-headed creature that waited in its sea cave with a patience older than the ship, and he navigated it because there was no other way, and he lost men there, and the sound of that loss settled into him like water into stone, slowly, permanently. There was an island green and still and warm, where the sun's cattle moved through meadows like living gold, and he said, "Do not touch them, do not touch them." And they touched them, And after that there was only the sea and the raft and the salt and the sky and the long silence of a man who has survived everything and is not sure yet whether that is a gift or something else. And then, for 7 years, there was an island at the navel of the sea, held in the arms of an immortal who loved him with a love that asked only that he stay, that he forget, that he let the shores of Ithaca recede into the soft mythology of a life he used to live. And he sat on the cliff above the water every evening and looked west, because west was where Ithaca was, and the looking was a kind of faithfulness, even when it felt like nothing more than grief. But the gods who had kept him there eventually turned their faces toward him again, and the raft was built, and the stars guided him, and there were gardens then, lit in lamplight, and music drifting across still Phaeacian water, and feasting, and the story told aloud to people who listened, as you are listening now, as if it were happening for the first time, as if every word were a boat being launched into still harbor water, and then the ship, dark-hulled and swift, carried him sleeping to a shore he had dreamed of for 20 years, and he woke on the beach of Ithaca, and did not know it at first, which is perhaps the strangest and most human thing in the whole long story. That you can long for something so completely, and still not recognize it when it is beneath your feet, but he came to know it, in the slow, careful way of a man who has learned that patience is not a lesser courage, but perhaps the greatest kind. He came to know it through the smell of the goat pens, and the sound of the bees, and the sight of his faithful swineherd's fire, burning in the early evening. He came to know it through his son's eyes, and his dog's last breath, and his wife's careful, brilliant test, the bough that no strange hand could bend, the secret of the bed that could not be moved, because its root was still living in the earth. He came to know it through the long arc of restoration. The hall made quiet again, the suitors gone, the weeping done at last, the loom standing still in the room where a woman had kept faith with the only weapon she had been given, her own intelligence, her own endurance, the slow thread of her own waiting. And now the hall is still. The fire on the hearth is low, and the light it gives is the amber light of things almost finished, things that have reached their proper end. The sea outside is quiet, the sea that was wine-dark and treacherous and monstrous and lonely and beautiful and cold and finally kind, lies flat and breathing in the dark, and on its surface the stars are reflected, every one of them, so that the water looks like the sky, and the sky looks like the water, and somewhere between them the whole long journey rests, like a boat that has been drawn up above the tide line and left there, safe. Let it rest. Let all of it rest inside you now. You have sailed every sea. You have heard the winds and outlasted them. You have kept your name through all the islands that tried to take it from you. And now you are home, in the warm dark and the breathing quiet, and the water is still, and the fire is low, and there is nothing left to do tonight but sleep.